Hello, fellow Sapiens, and welcome to Sleepless Homo. Before we begin, wherever you are, in bed, at the sink, driving, cooking, or just hiding from your inbox, this is your invitation to slow down. This channel is for quiet minds and curious ones. No noise, just science softly told. If you're winding down for sleep or getting through your day with headphones on, you're in the right place. And if you happen to drift off mid-story, don't worry, I've added full timestamps in the description, so you can pick up where you left off tomorrow. This one's worth hearing through. If you appreciate calm, educational long-form like this, consider liking and subscribing. It helps more people find content that doesn't shout. Just stories, real science, thoughtfully told. This is a place for humble sapiens. For those of us who don't claim to have all the answers, but still want to understand. If you'd like, let me know in the comments how you use this. Bedtime routine, focus aid, existential background noise, or where in the world you're listening from. And as always, stay curious, stay calm. Now, let's talk about fire. Not just the warmth, or the light, or the danger, but the question that still burns through a million years of silence. Did we invent it, or just borrow it? Long before we hunted with spears, long before we built hearths, cooked roots, or gave names to constellations, long before there was fire. It is older than memory, older than mammals, older than forests even. The first flame that ever burned on this planet did so in a world without humans, without birds, without grass. It burned in a silence we cannot imagine, under a sky that had only just begun to carry enough oxygen to feed the smallest flicker. And no one saw it. No eyes, no minds, no watchers, just chemistry, just a spark, a fuel, and the breath of air to carry it. We tend to think of fire as something we brought into the world, a human invention, a technological milestone, but that's not quite true. Fire was already here, blazing quietly across deep time, shaping landscapes and life itself before we ever stepped foot on this earth. To understand the story of how we came to use it, and perhaps how it came to use us, we need to start far earlier than any hominin fossil. We need to start in the Silurian. Roughly 420 million years ago, the Earth looked unfamiliar. Life was still largely marine, and the continents, clustered together in strange supercontinents like Gondwana and Laurentia, were just beginning to grow green with the first vascular plants. These early land pioneers were low, creeping things, nothing like modern trees. But they had stems, roots, and most importantly, they had tissues that could dry out. Fuel. For fire to exist, 3 conditions have to be met: fuel, oxygen, and ignition. In the Silurian, for the first time in Earth's history, all 3 came together. With plant tissues exposed to the open air, with atmospheric oxygen levels rising above 15%, and with the occasional lightning strike from a passing storm, fire could finally be born. The earliest direct evidence we have for this comes from fragments of charcoal locked inside ancient sedimentary rock. Charcoal, in the scientific sense, is fossilized carbon, the scorched remains of plant tissue that has been partially combusted but not fully oxidized. It preserves beautifully, and unlike ash, it doesn't simply blow away. It's how we know a fire happened, even if the flames themselves are hundreds of millions of years gone. Those first fires didn't rage through forests. There were no forests, but they danced across primitive peatlands and mossy ground covers, scorching mats of early plant life and leaving behind blackened carbon trails that would later turn into seams of coal. As vascular plants spread and evolved into taller, woodier forms, fire found a new home and a new role. It didn't just destroy, it began to shape ecosystems. By the early Carboniferous period, around 350 million years ago, oxygen levels in the atmosphere had climbed significantly. Some estimates suggest they peaked above 30%, far higher than today's 21%. This made the air itself more flammable, and it likely meant that fires during this period were hotter, faster, and far more widespread than modern wildfires. Some scientists call this the age of fire. Insects grew larger, thanks in part to the oxygen-rich air, and the expanding forests of lycopods and seed ferns became fuel-rich fire environments. Again, the charcoal record shows us that fire was common, not constant, but a regular part of the ecological cycle, and ecosystems responded. Fire-adapted plant traits began to appear in the fossil record: hard seed coats, rapid resprouting after damage. Eventually, in the age of flowering plants much later, we'd even see species that require fire to reproduce. Their seeds only germinate when triggered by heat or smoke. But even in these deep epochs, the pattern was emerging. Fire was a force that selected, shaped, and even favoured certain forms of life over others. It wasn't a one-time event, it was an evolutionary pressure. Of course, not every period in Earth's history has been equally flammable. Fire is sensitive to oxygen. When atmospheric oxygen levels drop below 15%, combustion becomes nearly impossible. That's why fire doesn't spread in space, or underwater, or in sealed rooms without ventilation. And it's why, during certain intervals of geological time, fires likely disappeared from the planet almost entirely. We know this from charcoal gaps in the fossil record, stretches of tens of millions of years with no evidence of combustion. The reasons for these low oxygen intervals are still being studied. Some are tied to shifts in global climate, others to massive volcanic events, or the burial of large amounts of organic carbon that locked oxygen away. Whatever the cause, the flame went out, and then, later, it came back. By the time the dinosaurs arrived in the Triassic and flourished through the Jurassic and Cretaceous periods, fire had become a permanent, recurring part of terrestrial life. Lightning-ignited wildfires raced through fern prairies and conifer forests, clearing ground and creating space for new growth. Some of the most fire-adapted plant lineages in the modern world, like pines, eucalypts and proteas, may have their origins in this era. Their thick bark, serotinous cones and chemical defences against herbivory all suggest long coevolution with flame. In fact, one study suggests that around 90 million years ago, during the late Cretaceous, wildfires were so common in some regions that entire ecosystems depended on them to maintain their balance. Remove the fire, and the vegetation would shift. Forest would replace grassland, species would disappear, and still, no one watched. No animals made campfires, no creatures gathered around for warmth or light. Fire existed as a purely natural force, sparked by lightning, fed by oxygen, shaped by weather and vegetation but unclaimed. Its role was ecological, not cultural. It was fuel recycling, not meaning-making. That would change, but not yet. After the asteroid impact that ended the Cretaceous 66 million years ago, global ecosystems were disrupted. Forests burned, skies darkened, and fire may have played a role both in the extinction and the recovery process. The Paleocene and Eocene saw the rise of mammals, small, fast and mostly nocturnal at first, and the eventual spread of early primates. But for tens of millions of years, even as forests regrew and grasslands expanded, there is no evidence that any species engaged with fire in a deliberate or patterned way. That brings us to the Miocene, around 7 million years ago. This is where the story starts to tilt. Not because fire changed, but because the landscape did. The spread of grasses and the formation of open savannas, especially in East Africa, created a new fire regime. Grass burns quickly and regenerates fast. Lightning fires in dry seasons became more common, and with them came ecological shifts. Tree cover thinned, grazing herbivores evolved to navigate a mosaic of burned and unburned patches. And somewhere in this mosaic, early hominins were watching. We don't know if they understood what they were seeing. That would be speculation. But we do know that modern chimpanzees and other primates are aware of fire. They avoid it. They watch it. In some experiments, they even seem to recognize its predictable behavior. There is no reason to assume early hominins were less observant. They likely saw fires move across the savannah. They likely foraged in recently burned areas, collecting scorched tubers, cracked nuts, or the roasted carcasses of small animals caught in the blaze. They may have noticed that burned land attracted grazing prey, that fire cleared thorny brush, that it brought both danger and opportunity, but there is no evidence that they controlled it. Not yet. Not in this stretch of time. This is the moment in the story when fire begins to shift from a background force to a foreground possibility, when it moves from ecosystem to encounter, when it becomes something our ancestors didn't just see, but maybe started to follow. The line between fear and fascination was beginning to blur. Still, if we're being honest, and science should always be honest, we don't know exactly when that shift happened. We don't know who lit the first fire. We don't know if it was a planned act or an accident. What we do know is that for hundreds of millions of years, fire shaped the earth without us, that it left trails of ash and carbon long before we ever built a hearth or boiled a root, that it was here, patient, burning, waiting, and when we finally arrived, we weren't the first to see it, but we may have been the first to wonder what it meant. Picture a horizon of golden grass, brittle and sun-cracked, stretching into the distance under a pale blue sky. Trees are few and scattered, their canopies flat and thin like nervous umbrellas. The wind moves quietly through the tall stems, then a strike. Not of language or tools or thought, but of lightning. The savanna catches, and fire races through the dry vegetation with a crackling rhythm as old as oxygen. Tall plumes of smoke rise over East Africa, and for the first time in a very long time, something different watches them pass. Between 3 million and 2 million years ago, East Africa was undergoing a transformation. The climate was shifting toward cooler, drier conditions. Dense tropical forests that once covered much of the region began to retreat, replaced by open woodlands, and eventually the grassy plains that today define the savanna. This wasn't a sudden change, but a slow environmental pivot. And with it came fire, not new, but newly frequent. Grasslands, as a biome, invite fire in. Their tall, dry vegetation builds up quickly and burns easily. The cycle of dry season lightning and flash ignition becomes not just a risk, but a regular event. Fire begins to etch itself into the rhythm of the landscape. This is where our ancestors were living. Not us exactly, not Homo sapiens, not even what we would call early humans, but hominins, Australopithecus afarensis, Australopithecus africanus, and eventually early members of our genus, Homo habilis and Homo erectus. They were upright walkers, with small brains and strong hands, living in environments that were no longer shaded and wet but exposed and dry. The savanna wasn't just a backdrop, it was a pressure system. It asked for new behaviours, new diets, and new strategies for staying alive. And within that system, fire was there. Not used, not made, but encountered. The question is, what did they do when it came? We don't have direct evidence of what Australopithecus did during a wildfire. Bones don't fossilise with memory. Sediment doesn't record fear, but we can infer a few things based on modern primates, ecological models, and the patterns left behind in the land. Fire in the savanna creates a mosaic. Some areas burn completely, others are spared. Within days of a fire, green shoots emerge in the blackened soil. Grazers are drawn to these fresh patches. Scavengers follow the grazers. Predators follow the scavengers. Fire doesn't just destroy, it resets. And animals, including primates, learn to exploit those resets. Chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, don't make fire. But they do interact with it. In the wild, they watch fires with caution and curiosity. They do not panic. They seem to understand the direction fire moves, the way wind and slope influence its spread. In captive studies, they even exhibit preferences for cooked food, choosing warm meals over raw when offered. This doesn't mean they understand combustion. But it does suggest that primates, and likely hominins, were not oblivious to flame. In a Miocene or early Pleistocene savanna, a hominin troop could have followed a fire line, not directly into it, but in the days after. The scorched zone would be easier to traverse, cleared of thorny underbrush. Burnt seeds and exposed roots could be collected. Small animals killed by the flames might be scavenged. The ground would be warm, dry, and less infested with insects. There would be advantages if one knew how to wait. This is where the concept of passive interaction enters the picture. Passive interaction means using something without controlling it. We see this across the animal kingdom. Birds use fire in remarkable ways. In Australia, raptors known as firehawks have been observed picking up burning sticks and dropping them elsewhere to flush out prey. Insects navigate toward flame for warmth or light. Even modern elephants are known to linger near burned zones to feed on newly sprouting plants. None of these behaviours require symbolic understanding. They are functional, practical, learned through observation and memory. There's no reason to think hominins were excluded from this spectrum. What's particularly important about this time period, between 3 million and 2 million years ago, is that we begin to see the emergence of more generalised behaviour in hominins. Australopithecus species, while adapted to tree climbing and forest foraging, were increasingly spending time in open habitats. Their diets became more varied. Dental evidence shows shifts toward tougher, drier plant material. Some populations may have begun using rudimentary stone flakes to assist with cutting or pounding, though not in any standardized way. This flexibility, cognitive and ecological, may have made them especially attuned to environmental disturbances like fire. But there's a line we must not cross. There is no evidence that these hominins were capturing fire, keeping it, or using it to alter their behaviour in any permanent way. No hearths, no soot, no charcoal layers with tools nearby. Fire, at this stage, remained wild. Its rhythm was not yet ours, and yet there is pressure. Not just environmental, but evolutionary. As fire became more frequent on the savannah, it shaped not only the terrain, but the selective forces acting on those who lived there. A troop that understood how to avoid fire, how to follow it safely, how to benefit from its aftermath, may have had an edge. Not just nutritionally, but socially. A dominant individual who led others to a recently burned patch filled with tubers or charred bones could gain status, mates, or security. And over time, these encounters may have fostered a deeper familiarity. Familiarity isn't the same as control, but it is a prerequisite. Before fire can be made, it must be known, and before it can be known, it must be seen again and again. In this window of time, the savannah may have offered fire not as a revelation, but as a recurring lesson. Not in the form of a myth or a ritual or a story told around a campfire. Those things did not exist, but as a pattern. A visual, visceral event with consequences that could be anticipated, avoided, or exploited. From a scientific perspective, this moment is difficult to study. There are no charred artifacts to analyse, no residues to date, no constructed features to map. Instead, we're left with paleo-environmental reconstructions, stable isotope data, sediment cores that show cycles of burning, fossil assemblages that suggest shifts in foraging strategies. It's the slow detective work of reconstructing context, not events, and it demands humility. We can't say what a hominin saw. We can only try to understand what the world was showing them. Still, the questions remain. Did fire scare them? Likely, yes. It scares us still. But did it also fascinate them? Did they pause, hidden in the brush, watching flames move across the plain, feeling the heat at a distance? Did they notice how the predators kept their distance, how the grass turned black and then green again? These are not questions we can answer with confidence. But they are questions worth holding, because it's here, in this space between fear and familiarity, that the long arc of fire and humanity begins to bend. Not toward mastery, not yet, but toward awareness. And perhaps that's the deeper story of this period. Not what fire did for us, but what it taught, without words, without teachers, without culture. Just light, movement, heat, and memory. The beginning of a recognition that the world could change suddenly, violently, and then grow back. We don't know when the first hominin walked toward a burn scar instead of away from it. We don't know when one of them decided to wait rather than flee. But the savannah would have rewarded those who did, and evolution, silent and patient, would have noticed. It's tempting to imagine that everything began with invention, that fire was a spark of genius, a single moment of insight. But more often, the truth is slower, less dramatic. Our relationship with fire may not have begun with a strike of flint, but with a slow, quiet watching, with footprints in the ash, with eyes adjusting to the glow on the horizon, with a cautious step forward, not to control it, but simply to follow, and that leaves us with a question, one that still smoulders beneath all the archaeological data, all the charcoal layers and cave soot and burnt bones. Before we made fire ours, how long did we just live beside it? There is a place in northern Kenya where the land is dry and fractured, where the bones of rivers long gone lie exposed to the sun, and the sediments run in bands of muted colour like a page half erased. 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿. It's not the first place you might think to look for a story about fire, but if we want to understand how our ancestors first came into contact with it, not just as watchers from the edge of the grassland, but as beings beginning to inhabit its rhythm, then this place, and this moment in time, maybe where the spark begins to change shape. Somewhere between 1,900,000 and 1,500,000 years ago, a new hominin was walking these shores. Taller than those who came before, longer-legged, broader-shouldered, with a brain volume just beginning to nudge upward, Homo erectus was not quite like the others. There was a stride in their walk, a range in their movement, a confidence in their presence on the open land. The anatomy tells us this was a species built not for the trees, but for the long march across savanna and scrub. Their bodies were adapted for endurance. Their hands were increasingly capable, and their eyes were set to the horizon. In this same stretch of time, excavations at 𝐓𝐈𝐴 began to reveal something odd. Archaeologists working in the early 1980s noticed patches of sediment that didn't match the surrounding earth. They were reddish, orange-tinted and compact, with signs of heating that penetrated several centimetres below the surface. Not just sun-baked or weathered, but transformed. These colour changes weren't random. They occurred in discrete areas, often associated with stone tools and fossilised bone fragments. And those bones, in some cases, showed signs of burning. Darkened edges, cracked surfaces, heat-altered textures. Nothing dramatic, nothing that screamed campfire, but enough to raise a question. Could this be evidence of fire? And if so, what kind? The first and most cautious interpretation is geological. Maybe these patches were caused by natural heating, volcanic activity, lightning strikes, wildfires that left behind pockets of scorched soil. East Africa sits along the Rift Valley, a region of tectonic activity, so heat from below is not implausible. But the distribution of the discoloration, the way it occurs in isolated circular formations, and not as wide bands or randomly spread streaks, suggests something more localized, more surface-bound, more selective. Then there are the stones. At 𝐓𝐈𝐴, archaeologists found lithic material that had been heat-modified. Some flakes showed thermal fractures consistent with exposure to high temperatures, and while it's true that many types of rock can crack under pressure or weathering, the pattern here matched what is often seen in fire-altered contexts: uneven spalling, surface crazing, and a glossy sheen that forms when stone is exposed to heat above 200 degrees Celsius. These are temperatures difficult to reach without flame. Still, fire by itself doesn't tell us much. What matters is context, and the context here is striking. In the same layers as these heated stones and oxidized soils, we find traces of a species capable of something new. Homo erectus, at 𝐓𝐈𝐴 and across East Africa, is associated with the first appearance of more complex stone tool traditions. The Herculean industry, hand axes, bifacial tools with symmetrical edges, not just broken rock but shaped instruments. This isn't intelligence in the modern sense, but it is intentionality, a kind of forethought, a plan carried through the palm of a hand. So the question becomes, did Homo erectus find fire, or follow it? There is no definitive evidence that this species controlled fire. No hearths, no constructed fire pits, no clear signs of repeated burning in the same location that would suggest habitual use. But there is growing suspicion that something was beginning to shift. That fire in this time and place may have moved from being an occasional environmental event to a more regular part of life. Still natural, still wild, but perhaps noticed, perhaps used, if only briefly and without mastery. One possibility is opportunistic use. Imagine a fire started by lightning. It moves through dry grass, kills a few small animals, chars some roots, exposes the earth. The next morning, a Homo erectus group moves in. They scavenge, they gather, they rest in the warmth. Maybe they carry a smouldering stick a short distance, trying to hold on to the heat a little longer. Not to cook, not to signal, but because it means something. Not symbolically, not spiritually, just functionally. Fire is light. Fire is heat. Fire keeps the flies away. It's speculative, of course. Science demands caution. These ideas are not confirmed by direct archaeological proof, but they are increasingly modelled by researchers studying the behaviour of early hominins and their likely interactions with environmental fire. And 𝐓𝐈𝐴 offers one of the earliest places where these questions become archaeologically grounded. What complicates the story further is the presence of multiple hominin species at the site. While Homo erectus is strongly associated with the tools and technology found here, another species, Paranthropus boisei, is also present in the fossil record. Paranthropus was smaller-brained, more robust in jaw structure, and likely specialised in hard plant foods. The debate remains open as to whether both species were using the same spaces at the same time, or whether their remains simply accumulated in the same geological layers over thousands of years. Either way, the presence of burnt bone and heated stone in contexts associated with Homo erectus lends weight to the idea that this species may have been at least near fire. Whether they made it, or merely used it, remains unknown. So what do we make of it? If the evidence is scattered, partial, and controversial, why focus on this period at all? Because this is where we begin to see the tension between what is natural and what is noticed, between the fire that reshapes a landscape and the beings beginning to think in landscapes. Homo erectus was not us, but they were beginning to live in ways that foreshadowed us. Their expanded range, from Africa to the Caucasus to Southeast Asia, their increasing dietary flexibility, their more refined tools, their longer childhoods and more cooperative group dynamics. All of these traits suggest a species increasingly capable of planning, sharing, and adapting. Fire fits into that world, not as a central tool, not yet, but as a presence. A quiet question. What is that? What does it do? And can I bring it closer? Some researchers have proposed that Homo erectus may have even influenced the occurrence of fire by altering the environment, by trampling vegetation, by building temporary shelters that left behind debris, by changing the way they move through their habitat. Fire ecology is not just about ignition, it's about what burns, when, and why. And hominins, simply by existing in new ways, may have made the land more fire-prone, and thus more fire-familiar. But again, we must be careful. The evidence from Cubifora does not confirm fire mastery. There is no direct proof of ignition, of containment, of repeated burning by the same group. What we have is suggestion, clues, discoloration, heat-altered artifacts, a species standing nearby, that's all. And for a good scientist that must be enough, at least for now. Still, the story is not without meaning, because it reminds us of the long, slow way that knowledge begins, not with a flash of genius, not with a single discovery, but with patterns, with exposure, with repetition. Fire was already old when Homo erectus emerged, but here, in these burnt soils of northern Kenya, we may be seeing the earliest footprints on the path towards something new, not just using fire, but beginning to imagine what it might become. And so we're left with a question that science hasn't answered yet. Maybe it never will. Did Homo erectus stumble into fire, or evolve beside it? The wind that rolls through the foothills of the Caucasus is sharp and insistent even today. It cuts through valleys carved by rivers older than memory, curls past rocky outcrops, and traces the contours of a small hill near the medieval town of Dmanisi, in what is now the Republic of Georgia. If you stand there in the wrong season without a coat, it doesn't take long to feel the discomfort settle in. The cold isn't devastating, but it's biting, persistent, the kind of cold that requires preparation, or insulation, or fire. But around 1,800,000 years ago, someone was here. At the Dmanisi site, scattered across a layer of sediment and basalt, archaeologists have uncovered something extraordinary: the remains of multiple individuals from an early population of Homo erectus, or perhaps a more primitive variant of the species. 5 skulls, several jawbones, and assorted postcranial elements have been found since the 1990s. Together they paint a picture of a small group of hominins living far outside the tropical and subtropical range that earlier generations of our ancestors had typically inhabited. And they were not passing through, they were staying. The question, of course, is how. Unlike our species today, or even the later Neanderthals, Homo erectus was not well adapted to cold climates. Their bodies were relatively slender, consistent with thermoregulation in hot environments. There is no evidence of tailored clothing, no known use of shelters, and at Dmanisi, crucially, no evidence of fire, no hearths, no charred bone, no heated stones, no ash deposits, just bones, tools, and sediment. Yet they persisted. for what seems to be multiple generations. To understand why this matters, we need to take a closer look at what kind of place Dmanisi was, and is. The site sits at a transitional altitude, high enough to experience winter frosts, yet low enough to remain biologically productive. It lies along a migratory corridor between Africa and Eurasia, a place where warm and cool climates clash and mingle. In the early Pleistocene, the region likely experienced cooler average temperatures than those found across most of East Africa. Not frigid in the Arctic sense, but cool enough to require adaptation. The fossils at Dmanisi suggest that these hominins were smaller than later Homo erectus populations, with brain volumes between 600 and 700 cubic centimetres. That's lower than the average for Homo erectus elsewhere and far below modern humans. But their faces are recognisably human-like, with projecting noses and reduced canine teeth. Their postcranial bones indicate efficient bipedalism, and their hands appear capable of precision grip, enough to hold and shape tools. The tools themselves belong to the older one tradition. Simple flakes, cores, and choppers, crude by later standards, but versatile. With them, this population could have butchered animals, cracked bones for marrow, scraped hides. There is no evidence of projectile weapons, composite tools, or anything resembling clothing. And yet, here they were, on the edge of what seems like ecological viability. One possibility for their survival in colder months is seasonal migration. The group may have moved down to lower elevations during winter, and returned to Dmanisi in more temperate periods. There is some paleo-environmental evidence suggesting a mosaic landscape. Open grassland mixed with patches of forest, which could have supported a wide range of plant and animal resources year-round. But the density of remains at the site suggests repeated occupation, not brief seasonal use. They seem to have come back again and again. Another possibility is social buffering. Group living can reduce individual risk. Huddling for warmth, sharing food, assisting the injured. These are behaviours seen in many social mammals and even in some birds. At Dmanisi, one of the skulls shows signs of having survived for years without teeth. That individual would have required help to process food. The implication is that care existed. Whether as instinct, emotion, or strategic behaviour we do not know, but it suggests a level of social cohesion beyond mere proximity. Then there is the role of scavenging. The fauna at Dmanisi includes large mammals, equids, bovids, carnivores. This would have offered opportunities for marrow extraction, tendon collection, and possibly even hide use. Some researchers speculate that hominins could have used animal skins as makeshift wraps, not tailored clothing but draped insulation. There is no direct evidence for this, but in the absence of fire, even the simplest coverings could have provided meaningful protection against the cold. Still, there is something unsettling about the absence of fire at Dmanisi. It's not just what's missing, it's what that absence implies. Fire would have offered so many advantages: warmth, predator deterrence, food sanitation, and yet these people, if we can call them that, appear to have lived without it, or at least without keeping it. Whatever their relationship to fire may have been elsewhere, at Dmanisi it left no mark. This leads us to an uncomfortable realization. We often view fire as a prerequisite for survival in marginal environments, but the Dmanisi evidence challenges that. It suggests that early Homo populations were more adaptable than we tend to assume, that they could survive, even thrive, at the edge of their thermal limits without technological insulation. That survival was not always about invention, but sometimes just endurance. There is also the possibility that what we call absence is simply an archaeological blind spot. Fire, unless contained in a hearth or associated with burnt bone, does not preserve well. Wind disperses ash. Rain removes traces. If fire was used at Dmanisi briefly, or outside the primary occupation zone, it might have left no archaeological signature. But here again, we must be honest. That is speculation. We cannot fill gaps with what we wish had been there. We can only work with what remains, and what remains at Dmanisi is striking. These were beings on the move, extending the reach of their genus far beyond its birthplace. They crossed deserts, rivers, and latitudes. They carried their tools, they buried nothing, they burned nothing. They left their bones and walked out of myth into data. If there is a story in Dmanisi, it is one of quiet resilience, of beings who were not prepared in the ways we define preparation, no fur, no fire, no fixed shelter, and yet who found a way to stay. They remind us that adaptation is not always technological. Sometimes it is anatomical. Sometimes it is behavioural. Sometimes it is simply enduring the night. It's tempting to imagine ourselves in their place, to project our needs backward. But we must resist. Their world was not ours. Their expectations were not ours. The cold may have been sharp, but it was not foreign. It was part of their landscape, part of their learning, and so the mystery lingers. Not just how they reached Dmanisi, or why they stayed, but what they felt as the temperature dropped, what they thought, if thought applies, what strategies they passed on not through language but through imitation, what comfort they found not in flame but in one another. There will always be gaps, in the fossil record, in the sediment, in the spaces between tool and hand. But Dmanisi gives us a glimpse of something astonishing, a hominin species, not yet fully human, living on the cusp of unfamiliar climate, without fire, not extinct, not fleeing, just living, quietly, cleverly, cold. And that leaves us with a strange question, one we rarely ask. What if the first migrations didn't require mastery, but simply the will to keep going? In the hills of central Kenya, where the land tilts gently into the Rift Valley and the grasses give way to rocky shelves of ancient sediment, there is a site called 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒𝐒. It doesn't shout for attention. There are no grand bones here, no monumental tools, just weathered exposures, thin stratigraphic bands and scattered fragments of clay, some of them red, hard and strangely transformed. They don't look like much. But buried in those clasts lies a question that has quietly unsettled archaeologists for decades. A question that has nothing to do with what we made, or where we went, or what we thought. It has to do with fire, and whether we were ever its first authors at all. The discovery was made in the mid-20th century, during surveys across the Laikipia Plateau. In a layer dated to approximately 1,400,000 years ago, researchers encountered a cluster of small, irregularly shaped pieces of clay. They weren't particularly beautiful, they weren't fashioned into objects, but their colour and texture were different from the surrounding sediments. These clasts were red, not just stained by iron, but fundamentally altered, baked. Microscopic analysis showed that the internal structure of the clay had been vitrified, meaning its minerals had been rearranged under intense heat. This wasn't the result of slow geological pressure or surface exposure to the sun. It was something else, something hot, something sudden. The mineralogy suggested that the clay had been heated to temperatures between 300 and 400 degrees Celsius. That's well beyond what can be reached by ordinary solar heating, or even typical decomposition processes. And while volcanic activity can produce such conditions, there were no signs of lava flow or thermal intrusion nearby. What was left was a short list of possible explanations. One of them was fire. If the clasts were indeed burned, the question becomes what kind of fire could have caused it. Wildfires are a candidate, especially in open savanna environments where dry grass and brush provide regular fuel. But for the clay to vitrify the way it did, the heat source would need to be sustained and direct, not just a brush pass, but a burn that lingered. And that's where the archaeological interest deepens, because nearby these clay fragments, stone tools were also found. Oldowan-style flakes, simple, direct, and sharp. The kind of tools we associate with early Homo species, likely Homo erectus or a local variant. The tools themselves weren't burnt, nor were their bones found with thermal damage. But the proximity of lithics to fire-altered clay raised an eyebrow in the research community. Could this be evidence, early, fleeting and ambiguous, of a hominin fire? The debate that followed was not one of enthusiasm, but caution. It still is. Scientific skepticism at its best is a form of reverence for the unknown. The problem wasn't the clay. That it had been heated was not in question. The problem was the absence of context. No hearth, no charcoal, no fire ring, no recurring ash layer. Just baked earth, tools nearby, and a timeline that sits uncomfortably early in the story we think we understand. Some have argued that the clay could have been burned by natural causes, that lightning may have struck a patch of brush and heated the ground beneath it long enough to alter the mineral composition. Others propose the tools and the clay are coincidental in their association, deposited over time by unrelated processes, and merely appearing close due to the compression of sedimentary layers. A third possibility, rarely mentioned aloud, is that fire here was being manipulated, not controlled in any sustained way, but perhaps approached, used, not made, but known. There is no way to resolve that ambiguity yet, but there is something valuable in its presence, because it reminds us how subtle the archaeological record of fire can be, how easily it can be erased. Fire doesn't fossilize, it doesn't leave durable artifacts unless it touches something durable: bone, stone, ceramic, soil. And when it does, interpretation becomes a delicate negotiation between chemistry and context. What makes 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒𝐒 so important, then, is not what it proves, it's what it forces us to ask. What is the earliest possible evidence of fire interaction? What threshold of confidence do we require before we can say this was deliberate? And how many traces have we lost? Not because they weren't there, but because we didn't know to look. One of the quiet ironies of early fire archaeology is that the earliest uses may have left the faintest marks. Before the building of hearths, before the long-term occupation of caves, before the carbon layers and cooked bones and scorched tools, there may have been small, scattered instances of interaction. A flame kept alive for a few hours, a smouldering twig moved from one place to another. A moment where heat was noticed, not feared, not yet replicated, but recognised. 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒𝐒 gives us a tantalising glimpse of that moment, and it does so in a language that is maddeningly partial. Heat signatures in clay, mineral transitions, no footprints, no firewood, no myth, just transformation and silence. Still, the silence is not without meaning. It reminds us of the humility required in paleoscience. That absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but neither is it a license for storytelling. That the burden of proof remains high, especially for claims as foundational as fire, and that while our ancestors may have flirted with flame, the traces they left behind may never quite speak clearly, but that doesn't mean they didn't try, or that we shouldn't keep listening. If there is a lesson in 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒𝐒, perhaps it is this, that sometimes what matters most is not the fire we controlled, but the fire we didn't, the one that happened beside us. Without our input, without our consent, that altered the ground and left us wondering whether it had anything to do with us at all, because that's the honest state of early fire research. We don't know who lit the first flame, we don't know when or where or why. What we have are baked clues in ancient soil, and the quiet possibility that the fire we think of as ours might never have belonged to us to begin with. It's hard to imagine a more ancient silence than the one that settled over the Kalahari Basin 1 million years ago. Back then, before there were maps or myths or even modern minds to make sense of them, there was only open land, weathered stone, and the long march of time, each day indistinguishable from the last, unless perhaps something caught fire. There's a cave here called Wonderwerk, quietly tucked into the side of an ancient hill in the northern Cape of South Africa. Today, it's a heritage site. Then, it may have been something else entirely, the site of the first flame ever purposefully held inside a shelter. Not sparked, not kindled, just held, preserved. Long enough perhaps to matter. The idea that a 1 million-year-old cave might cradle the earliest known signs of human fire feels almost too symbolic to be true, but that's precisely what makes the site so compelling. Because for all our myths about man discovering fire, the truth is far messier. There's no Prometheus here, no single lightning bolt or brilliant leap forward, just ash, bone, sediment, microscopic layers of heat-altered earth, compressed by time, complicated by geology, and interpreted cautiously by archaeologists who know better than to ever claim certainty. So what exactly did they find? Beneath the modern desert crust of Wonderwerk, archaeologists uncovered sediment sequences stretching back nearly 2 million years. Within these ancient deposits, at levels dating to around 1 million years ago, researchers noticed something unusual. First, scattered fragments of burnt bone, animal remains bearing heat damage inconsistent with external wildfires. Then, faint but consistent signs of ash, deeply embedded within the cave's interior. Importantly, this wasn't surface-level soot from a recent lightning strike. The ash was buried, compacted and layered, suggesting it had formed in place, and over time. That distinction matters. Fire outside is one thing. A wildfire rips through the savannah and scatters both predator and prey. But a fire inside, a fire in a cave, suggests more than coincidence. It implies containment, shelter, maybe even intent. The sediments at Wonderwerk were analysed using microstratigraphy, a technique that allows scientists to detect even the subtlest chemical changes in compacted Earth. They also used Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy to distinguish between naturally heated soil and ash, formed by burning organic matter. The results pointed, again and again, to controlled fire, at least in the sense that it had been sustained within the cave itself. But here's the complication. Controlled does not mean created. There's no evidence that the hominins occupying Wonderwerk knew how to spark a flame. No charred sticks shaped into fire drills. No flint or pyrite-bearing stones showing deliberate wear. What they may have done, however, is take advantage of what nature gave them. If lightning struck the plains, and flames reached the edge of camp, perhaps they learned to carry embers inside. Maybe they learned to feed them slowly, or maybe, just maybe, they noticed that some fires burned better than others when tucked into a windless cave. There's a haunting restraint in how scientists talk about this period. No one claims mastery, no one suggests invention. The phrasing used is always cautious, always conditional. Evidence suggests. Possible hearth, likely localised burning. And that's precisely what makes the Wonderwerk findings so compelling. They sit right on the edge of inference, where data runs out and curiosity takes over. Some scholars have pushed back, arguing that the ash could have been windblown, or that the heat-altered bones might result from ancient geochemical processes. And those challenges matter. In a field this old, skepticism is not just welcome, it's essential. The line between cultural activity and natural coincidence is notoriously thin when looking back over 1 million years, but the weight of the evidence continues to lean, however slightly, toward early human involvement. The ash layers are too regular, too deeply embedded, and too far from the cave's mouth to suggest anything other than long-term use. The heat damage on bones appears consistent with low-temperature burning, like what you might see in a smouldering hearth, not a forest blaze. And while nothing here proves fire creation, everything points towards something equally important: fire management. To manage a fire is in many ways harder than to start one. It requires patience, attention, a willingness to stay put, and most of all, a deepening awareness of cause and effect. If I feed this ember, it survives. If I neglect it, it dies. This quiet shift from chaos to continuity may have been one of the earliest signs of a truly human mind. We don't know which hominin species used Wonderwerk. It may have been Homo erectus. It may have been an even earlier population. Whoever they were, they left no tools in the ash, no cave paintings, no symbolic traces of self-awareness. But they did leave heat, trapped, layer by layer, in a cave that has since outlived ice ages, extinctions, and every story ever told around a fire. And that in itself raises a strange question. What did it feel like to sit beside the first contained flame? Was it relief? Fear? Boredom? Did they sleep better that night, with the flicker on the cave wall casting off the shadows? Or did they simply crouch there, eyes open, watching a thing they didn't yet understand, and somehow knew not to extinguish? There are no answers, only sediment, and still, we keep asking. Because somewhere in that ash lies a threshold we crossed without knowing it. Not the moment we made fire, but the moment we stayed with it. And perhaps quietly, it stayed with us too. If you had to walk into winter without fire, would you make it out? It's not just a thought experiment. Somewhere between 1 million and 500,000 years ago, early humans, or something like them, did exactly that. Long before woolen cloaks or hearth-lit caves, long before even the certainty that anyone could make fire at will, hominins were spreading into Europe, and somehow they survived. Or at least some of them did. We know they were there. Stone tools tell us. Bones tell us. Sites like Atapuerca in Spain and Happisburg in England leave behind unmistakable signs, not of warmth, but of presence. They chipped flint, hunted game, and butchered carcasses beneath skies that offered more frost than shelter. The trouble is what's missing. If they had fire, it didn't leave a trace. No hearths, no scorched sediment, no layers of ash. not even a singed bone to whisper, "We burned something." It's an archaeological silence that's hard to ignore. This silence, though, isn't always the final word. The absence of evidence, as scientists constantly remind each other, is not the same as evidence of absence. Hearths might not survive, burnt wood decomposes, bones get scavenged. Even in more recent archaeological layers, fire can be elusive. And yet, when the layers stretch back 1,000,000 years and still offer no trace, across sites, across regions, it raises a harder question. What if they really didn't have fire? What if they crossed into winter with nothing more than sharp rocks and a problem-solving brain? The cold of Ice Age Europe was not always constant. Much of the Pleistocene oscillated between glacial and interglacial phases, long epochs of frigid wind broken by warmer spells. Migration might have followed these cycles, with early hominins expanding north during warmer pulses, then retreating south when things froze. It's one way to survive the cold, by running from it. But migration comes with its own costs. It requires awareness, memory, cooperation. It forces groups to move with the seasons, perhaps even with the herds. Did they move deliberately, or did they simply follow food? Were they explorers or drifters? No one knows. The fossil record does not capture intention. Another way to survive the cold is to outwit it. That's where shelters enter the picture. Not houses, but hideouts. Natural formations, overhangs, shallow caves, maybe even windbreaks built from scavenged branches and bones. Nothing grand, just enough to stay out of the wind. But even this idea walks a tightrope. Temporary shelters rarely leave archaeological signatures. Unless something collapses, burns, or accumulates sediment, it vanishes. Which means we're left trying to imagine behaviour from what hasn't fossilized. Then there's the question of clothing. If fire was absent, warmth must have come from somewhere. Fur hides, perhaps, scraped and tied crudely around the body. There's no direct evidence of this. No preserved threads, no needles, no buttons. But the logic is compelling. Skinning animals is something even modern chimps can learn. With basic tools, cutting hide becomes easier. And while fashion was surely not the point, insulation may have been a matter of life or death. Some researchers have even proposed that early humans had denser body hair, a remnant of earlier ancestors better adapted to the elements. Again, we don't know. Hair doesn't fossilize, but neither do intentions. The body can adapt in many ways, and evolution rarely asks for our permission. Still, if they lacked fire, not just the ability to make it, but the knowledge to keep it, then food must have been consumed raw. That's not impossible. Raw meat, marrow, and tubers can sustain life, but they demand more from the gut. Some paleoanthropologists suggest that the digestive tract of early Homo erectus was still robust enough to handle it. Others, like Richard Wrangham, point to the shrinking guts and jaws in later hominins as evidence that cooking eventually became essential. But around 1,000,000 years ago, it's plausible that raw food still ruled the menu. Warmth, not calories, was the bigger problem. And so we're left with a puzzle. Fossils in cold places, no fire, no shelter, no clear signs of clothing. Yet somehow these early migrants endured, at least long enough to leave behind tools and bones. Perhaps that's all endurance means, archaeologically speaking. Long enough to leave a trace. Sites like Pakefield and Happisburgh in England suggest human presence even in high-latitude environments. In Happisburgh's case, footprints preserved in estuarine mud tell us someone walked there nearly 900,000 years ago. Someone with a human-like foot walking beside what might have been children. The climate at the time was mild by British standards, but still brisk compared to the equatorial homelands of their ancestors, and still no fire. In southern Europe, the picture grows murkier. Atapuerca, in northern Spain, has yielded both stone tools and fossilized remains from around 800,000 years ago. Homo antecessor, perhaps, another early player in the human story. Here again, signs of butchery and tool use abound, but signs of fire are absent. Did they eat raw meat? Did they huddle in caves through wind and rain? Or did they migrate in and out with the turning seasons, never staying long enough to need a flame? Some scholars argue that fire may have been used intermittently, but without permanence. A spark carried from a wildfire, nurtured for a few days, then lost. Such use would be nearly invisible in the fossil record. No hearths, no build-up, no pattern, just passing flame, borrowed, not made. And when it flickered out, there was no second chance. unless lightning struck again. In that view, fire was not yet a tool. It was a fleeting opportunity. Others suggest that the ability to control fire had simply not emerged, that these early Europeans were cold adapted in other ways, perhaps higher metabolic rates, perhaps behavioural plasticity, a fancy way of saying they figured things out as they went. Maybe social bonding was enough, group warmth, shared body heat, communal sleeping. Again, we don't know. But survival often has more to do with flexibility than technology. What makes this period so compelling is that it defies our modern instincts. We associate intelligence with control, mastery, domination of environment. Fire, in our minds, is a hallmark of civilization. To imagine humans, or something like them, surviving without it feels like heresy. And yet, the evidence leads us there. Not because it's obvious, but because it's missing. So perhaps the question isn't whether they had fire. Perhaps the better question is, how did they think without it? Did the absence of flame shape the pace of their evenings? Did darkness fall heavier? Did predators come closer? Or was the silence of night simply another part of the world they moved through? Without fear, without mastery, just with caution and memory. Fire would come later. With it would come permanence, settlement, light at night, and the slow unravelling of time into seasons, rituals and stories. But before that there were migrations into wind. Cold feet on frozen ground, sharp stones, raw meat, and minds, perhaps, just beginning to understand that not all problems had answers. Not yet. We walk through those same winters now with central heating and electric stoves and a sense of detachment from the world's cold. But the question lingers. If they did it without fire, what are we still not seeing? What have we forgotten about the raw edge of survival? The kind that doesn't need to burn to leave a scar? Fire leaves behind a signature, not always a bold one. Sometimes it whispers in ash, fractures flint, or stains the earth a colour too faint for the naked eye to read. But at a place called Gesher Benot Yaakov in what is now Israel, that whisper might be just loud enough to change the story. The site sits along the banks of the Jordan River, and beneath layers of sediment lie hints of something extraordinary. Charred wood, blackened seeds, burned flint tools, all arranged not in chaos but in strange, repeating patterns, as if someone or something was returning to the same place over and over, doing the same quiet ritual with fire, and then leaving again without a trace of a hearth. This is not a campfire in the modern sense. There is no circle of stones, no thick deposit of charcoal, no hearth wall baked red by years of use. In fact, some archaeologists hesitate to call it fire use at all. There is no hearth, they argue, only debris scattered across space. Others disagree. The burnt materials, they point out, are not random. They cluster in spatially distinct zones. Flint tools with burn marks here, charred seeds there. Some argue that these aren't remnants of a natural wildfire or lightning strike. They suggest that whoever occupied this site almost 800,000 years ago might have been managing fire deliberately. Not building fireplaces yet, but laying out their activities around invisible hearths. Hence the term phantom hearths. Places where fire clearly played a role, but where no architectural fire structure remains. It's a subtle theory, but it leans heavily on patterns, not just the presence of fire, but the repetition of how, where, and why it was used. The team that excavated Gesher Benot Yaakov found this kind of patterning across multiple occupational layers, and within these layers they discovered more than just ash. They found thousands of artifacts, animal bones with butchery marks, plant remains, and critically, waterlogged materials preserved in a way that's unusually rich for a site of this age. The presence of water may actually be one reason fire traces at Gesher Benot Yaakov are so elusive. A wet environment can distort or erase some of the usual chemical signals we rely on to confirm combustion. Yet, paradoxically, it may also help preserve fragile evidence like charred wood and seeds. And that's what makes this site so important. The repeated appearance of burned materials across distinct activity zones may be the closest we can get to watching early humans, or their close relatives, begin to spatially organise fire in their lives without yet fully mastering it. The timeline here matters. Gesher Benot Yaakov dates to roughly 790,000 years ago. That's far earlier than the consistent hearth seen in Europe, or the symbolic fire used later, hypothesized in places like 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒𝐒. The hominins here were not modern humans. Most researchers agree they were likely members of the species Homo erectus, or possibly a closely related lineage that had adapted to life in the Levant. They lived in a time when control over fire was still new, if it existed at all. And yet they seem to have behaved in ways that suggest they weren't merely reacting to natural fires, but doing something more intentional. One theory is that fire here was conserved, not created. Perhaps a blaze from a lightning strike was carefully tended, fed with dry material, shielded from the wind. Maybe dung or moss was used to slow its burn, to make it last through the night. The presence of specific types of wood and tinder at the site points to some kind of selection process, though how conscious it was is hard to say. Fire conservation doesn't require striking a spark. It only requires patience, and the presence of mind to recognise what fire can do and why it's worth preserving. But the implications stretch further. If the inhabitants of Gesher, Benot, 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒𝐒 were using fire repeatedly in the same zones, that may hint at a growing awareness of space, of function. This is not just about heat or protection. It may represent the dawn of domesticity, in a deep and primitive form, spatial control, even without walls. The idea that certain tasks happen in certain places, cooking here, tool-making there, may reflect the roots of behavioural modernity. Not symbolic yet, not abstract, but structured, purposeful. Some have even argued that this kind of fire patterning implies an early form of cognition that goes beyond instinct. It suggests memory, routine, possibly even teaching. If you return to the same spot again and again to perform the same fire-related task, you're not just reacting, you're remembering. And if young individuals at the site watched elders manage fire in specific ways, there may have been an early culture of learning involved. No words required, just quiet demonstration. Still, many scholars urge caution. There is no direct evidence of fire starting at this site, no flint struck together, no pyrite, no scorch marks from spark testing. That absence of ignition material leads some to argue that the site represents opportunistic use only, not control. Others disagree, pointing to the structured spatial zones as indirect evidence of mastery. It's a debate that remains unresolved and likely will for decades. But in the meantime, the ghost of the hearth lingers. One lingering question is why these fire traces disappear in some later sites, only to reappear again much later. If fire was being used here, why didn't the behaviour spread more widely or more consistently? Did the knowledge die with these groups? Was fire mastery discovered and lost multiple times in different places? Or was it always present, but just invisible to the kinds of archaeology we know how to do? The phantom hearth theory reminds us of a hard truth in science. Sometimes, absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Fire doesn't always leave behind a fireplace. In wetlands and floodplains, it can leave only shadows, char marks on seeds, subtle colour shifts in flint. And yet those shadows may be telling the story of one of the first times our ancestors gathered around warmth, not by accident, but by design. The idea is haunting because it implies the existence of communities and behaviours we can barely glimpse. The people of Gesher, Benot, 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒 are gone, their names and languages unknown. But in the blackened tips of seeds and the fractured edges of flint, they left behind a trace of something fragile and possibly deliberate. A warmth that wasn't just borrowed from nature, but carried through time, passed hand to hand in the dark, before the first true flame was ever struck. And so we're left with a question, not of where the first hearth stood, but whether it ever had to. Can a fire be controlled if it's never truly seen? The oldest hearths we know of do not belong to us. They belong to someone we barely remember, if we remember them at all. Before Neanderthals, before Homo sapiens, before the flicker of symbolic art or the carving of bone tools, there was another kind of hominin. Taller than some, likely stockier than most, and armed with a brain nearly as large as ours, Homo Heidelbergensis was once among the most widespread humans on Earth. Yet today they linger mostly as a name in a few museum exhibits. But buried in the dark soils of Europe and the Middle East, something still glows faintly from their time. The earliest physical traces of fire used not just opportunistically, but repeatedly, purposefully, perhaps even communally. And that faint glow might be the closest we'll ever come to witnessing the very birth of the hearth. At Beecher's Pit in Suffolk, England, the story begins quietly. Around 400,000 years ago, this place was part of a floodplain woodland, dense, damp, and not easily flammable. Yet scattered across the site, archaeologists found hardened patches of reddened earth, oxidized sediments, and most importantly, clusters of charcoal and charred bone nestled within shallow basins. These weren't wildfires. The patterns were too consistent, too localized. Microscopic analysis of the surrounding soil suggested sustained heating from within, not above, and temperature estimates hovered between 500 and 700 degrees Celsius. That's hot enough to burn wood efficiently, but not so hot as to be accidental. Near these hearths were hundreds of flint flakes, broken tools, and butchered animal remains. In other words, people were living here, and they weren't just surviving, they were tending fire. The same glow appears again in central Germany, at Schöningen. Here, around the same general period, a marshland landscape once hosted what is now one of the most famous discoveries in Paleolithic archaeology, a set of wooden spears, perfectly balanced, fire-hardened, and found alongside horse bones, some pierced by the very tips of those weapons. The preservation of wood in the archaeological record is rare enough, but wood shaped by fire, that's even rarer. The outer surfaces of the Schöningen spears were chemically altered in a way that suggests deliberate charring followed by polishing, a technique still used in some traditional cultures to strengthen wooden implements. Though the site itself has ambiguous traces of fire residue, the implications are direct. Wherever that fire was, it wasn't decorative. It was functional, and someone knew how to use it. Further south, in what is now Israel, the cave of Theban offers a slower burning mystery. Layers of sediment here preserve what may be a longer sequence of occupation, stretching from 500,000 years ago into more recent Middle Paleolithic periods. Within those layers are discrete bands of ash and burnt flint, spatially repeated in the same general locations across multiple strata. No one carved a formal fireplace, but someone, or rather, generations of someones, kept coming back to the same spots and building fires. That kind of repetition doesn't happen by accident. Whether it was for warmth, for cooking, for keeping animals away, or just because it made the cave feel more like home, fire was beginning to shape not just survival, but routine. The people who left these traces were likely not one species, but many regional variants of Homo heidelbergensis, or, depending on the classification system used, archaic Homo sapiens. They lived during a time of growing ecological instability. Glacial pulses swept across Europe. Forests gave way to steppes. Game animals migrated, food sources shrank. In that context, fire wasn't just a tool, it was a survival strategy. And perhaps even more than that, it was a continuity. A flame passed down not just from individual to individual, but from generation to generation. Still, we can't see their hands. We don't know their words. We have no myths from them, no stories, no symbolic objects to guess their thoughts. The hearths we find are silent, the spears inert, and this is where humility matters most. Because for all our fascination with fire as a symbol of humanity's rise, the evidence is thin, scattered, and always open to reinterpretation. Some scholars have argued that many so-called hearths could be natural burn marks. Others question whether these hominins truly made fire themselves or simply maintained it when they could. After all, no one has found the match. We see only the result, but the pattern remains. From the English woodlands to the Israeli caves, from burned horse meat to scorched spear tips, the presence of fire in hominin contexts around 400 to 700,000 years ago suggests something was changing. Not instantly, not universally, but gradually and in multiple places at once. Fire was no longer just a frightening force to flee from, or a lucky find after a lightning storm. It was being integrated, managed, tended, and perhaps most crucially remembered. We don't know if Homo heidelbergensis worshipped fire. There's no reason to assume they did, but it's not hard to imagine them gathered around it, watching the embers fall, knowing that tomorrow's warmth depended on tonight's embers. In that moment, the hearth becomes something more than chemistry. It becomes culture, and yet, In a twist both humbling and sobering, Homo heidelbergensis did not last. Their lineages branched. Some likely led to Neanderthals, others perhaps to us. But as a distinct population they vanished. The fires they once tended flickered out, and if there were any final sparks in those hearths, they burned in silence, unseen. So perhaps the haunting question is not who lit the first fire, but who sat beside it, not knowing it might be their last. There is something unsettling about a circle of ash, something both final and intimate. You don't leave a circle of ash unless something happened there, something alive, something that burned. And perhaps, in the case of a cave in central Israel nearly 400,000 years ago, something that never quite stopped burning. 𝐓𝐀𝐌𝐏𝐒 cave was first found not by a wandering hominin but by a road crew. In the year 2000, a stretch of highway excavations sliced into the limestone crust of the Judean hills. Beneath it, the earth opened to reveal a chamber sealed for hundreds of thousands of years. Inside, what emerged was not the fossilized skeleton of a forgotten ancestor. It was evidence of something more elusive: habit, repetition, return, and above all, heat. Here, inside the layers of 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒𝐒 cave, archaeologists found traces not of a single fire, but of fire sustained. A central hearth, circled again and again by those who came back to this place, lit it, fed it, and stayed. There were bones, burned and broken, ash, fine and layered, flint tools, fractured and discarded near the coals. Together they suggest not a one-time miracle of combustion, but something that began to resemble rhythm, a rhythm of presence, a rhythm of flame. To understand what this means, we have to talk about absence, because for most of our species' deep past, fire is almost always a ghost. There are places where we find burnt bone or scorched rock or clay that has seen temperatures far above ambient heat. But rarely do we find a pattern. Rarely do we find a location so stable, so habitually returned to, that it begins to feel not like a chance encounter with flame, but something closer to trust. The hearth at 𝐓𝐻𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒𝐒 is about 2 meters wide. It sits near the centre of the cave, surrounded by debris from stone tool manufacture, as well as a collection of animal bones bearing the unmistakable signature of both butchery and burning. Some of the bones were cracked while still fresh, likely to extract marrow. Others were calcined, subjected to fire intense enough to alter their chemistry. These are not the accidental remnants of a wildfire. These are the traces of a species learning to stay warm. What makes 𝐓𝐻𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒𝐒 significant is not just that the fire burned, it's that it burned again. Across layers, in deposits that span tens of thousands of years, researchers have found repeated evidence of fire use in the same central location. The ash accumulated, the burnt bones piled up. And the tools, flint blades, many produced using a sophisticated method known as the naviform technique, clustered around the hearth like footprints around a campfire. Whoever lived here, they didn't just light a fire and leave. They came back. The layers of 𝐓𝐻𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒𝐒 preserve not only what was burned, but how it was arranged. Ash and charcoal fragments show signs of intentional placement. There is spatial organisation. Some bones were found in zones separate from the tool debris, suggesting that specific activities may have occurred in different parts of the cave. This points to a growing cognitive capacity to structure space, to think not just in terms of survival, but in terms of living, of where to eat, where to rest, and where to let the fire burn. But what does it mean to have a hearth? At a basic level, it means warmth. The Levant during this period, roughly 400,000 years ago, was marked by climatic instability. The ability to control fire, or at least to maintain it, would have conferred enormous advantages, not only for heating, but for light, for deterring predators, for expanding the usable hours of the day, and for reducing the energy cost of digestion through the warming of meat and fat, even if not fully cooking it, a detail we'll return to much later. Yet there is more to a hearth than thermodynamics. The consistent presence of fire suggests something social, something shared. Flame, after all, is hard to divide. You can take your flint blade and walk away. You can carry a bone to a corner of the cave, but the fire, it draws you back. It gathers. It holds. And in doing so, it may have become the first true centre of the early human life. The inhabitants of 𝐓𝐶𝐈𝐿 cave were not Homo sapiens. They were likely a transitional population, possibly related to Homo heidelbergensis or an early branch of Homo sapiens itself, depending on which researcher you ask. Their teeth and bones show a unique mixture of traits, some archaic, some surprisingly modern. What is clear is that whoever they were beginning to live in ways no species before them had managed. Not just surviving in a landscape, but building a relationship with a specific place, and with the fire that lived there. To be clear, this was not yet full fire mastery. There is still no solid evidence that these hominins could create fire on demand. More likely, they maintained fire from natural sources, carrying embers, feeding flames with dry dung or wood, nurturing coals to last the night. But the implications are no less profound, because maintaining fire requires planning, vigilance, cooperation. You cannot keep a hearth alive alone. One of the more compelling aspects of 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒𝐓𝐀 is what it suggests about return. This was not a seasonal camp, briefly occupied and then abandoned. It was used over generations. The stratigraphy, the layering of deposits over time, shows persistent occupation. The hearth was not just a tool, it was a landmark, a memory site, perhaps even a proto-home. It's important not to romanticize this too quickly. The people who lived here did not sit in cozy circles telling myths beside the flickering light. They were butchers and foragers. They broke bones to get at fat. They chipped stone to slice through sinew. Their lives were shaped by climate shifts, predator threats, and the brutal uncertainty of subsistence. But even in that world, they kept the fire burning. They made a habit of it. And habit, in evolutionary terms, is no small thing. There are scientists who argue that 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒𝐓𝐀 represents a cognitive leap, not because the fire was used, but because it was used with intention, with structure, because it altered the way space was perceived, the way tasks were divided, the way tools were deposited and reused. Fire, in this view, was not just a survival strategy. It was a catalyst for a new way of thinking about life. Still, we should be careful. We are creatures with a tendency to see ourselves in the past, to read into an ash circle the outline of a living room, to turn a burnt bone into a dinner party. And while these associations may help us feel connected to our ancestors, they can also obscure the deep alienness of their experience. 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐾𝐒𝐓 does not tell us that early hominins were like us. It tells us that fire began to change them, slowly, repetitively, layer by layer. Perhaps that is the lesson of the ash. Not that we mastered fire in a single spark, but that we came back to it, again and again, until it became something more than a tool, something more than a defense against the dark, until it became a place, a presence, a quiet center in a dangerous world. And maybe that's what we're still doing, returning to the glow, not because we understand it fully, but because it makes the dark a little less lonely. They say fire changed us, that it transformed meat into memory, roots into ritual, and the raw edge of hunger into something more survivable. But beyond warmth, beyond fear and fascination, the question becomes more intimate. What if fire also changed our bodies? Not in scars or burns, but in the silent architecture of bone and gut and jaw. What if we don't just carry fire in myth or memory, but in molars, bellies, and brains? The idea sounds poetic, but it's been quietly building a case in science. Anthropologist Richard Wrangham, among others, has argued that the control of fire, and more specifically cooking, may have driven some of the most defining changes in our anatomy. Not all at once, and not with proof carved into stone tools or painted on cave walls, but in the evolutionary fossil trail of what came before us. To understand it, we need to rewind, not to the first fire in a hearth, but to the first pressures that reshaped the hominin digestive system. About 2 million years ago, our genus, Homo, was emerging in a landscape that had changed. The spread of open savannas in Africa, the rise of new ecological pressures, and the decline of forest-based foods meant that raw vegetation alone no longer offered the easiest calories. For earlier hominins like Australopithecus, chewing raw tubers and fibrous roots required large molars, strong jaws, and a powerful gut capable of breaking down tough plant matter. Their bodies were built around the idea of brute processing, long intestines, wide rib cages, and faces adapted for grinding. But something started to shift in the fossil record. Homo erectus, appearing around 1.9 million years ago, begins to show a different anatomical profile. The jaws get smaller, the teeth shrink, especially the molars. The ribcage narrows, suggesting a shorter gut, and the brain, it starts to grow, not explosively but steadily. Wrangham's theory asks us to connect those dots. Smaller guts and bigger brains are not just correlated, they might be causally linked. Brains, after all, are metabolically greedy. They demand a disproportionate amount of energy, about 20% of our resting metabolic rate, despite only being 2% of our body weight. Supporting that kind of energy-hungry organ while simultaneously powering a huge digestive system would be difficult. But what if you didn't need such a large gut anymore? What if your food was already softened, chemically broken down, and more calorically accessible because it had been cooked? Cooking changes food. Heat denatures proteins, gelatinizes starches, and makes many nutrients easier to absorb. It also destroys some toxins and pathogens. That means cooked food provides more net energy for less digestive effort. For early Homo, this could have meant less time chewing, faster digestion, and more calories available to fuel that slowly expanding brain. Over evolutionary time, the body could begin to economize: a smaller jaw, a less robust chewing apparatus, a shortened intestine, and a shift in energy budgeting toward cognitive capacity. Wrangham's hypothesis is not universally accepted, but it is testable in pieces. Comparative biology shows that animals with high-quality, easy-to-digest diets tend to have smaller guts. Laboratory studies with modern primates demonstrate that cooking increases energy absorption, and some models even suggest that without cooking, the human body could not get enough calories from a raw diet to sustain both our current brain size and daily activity levels. Modern raw foodists often lose weight, and menstruation can cease in women on long-term raw diets, suggesting that our physiology may indeed depend on cooked food. Still, the archaeological record remains silent on exactly when cooking began. The earliest hearths, as seen in places like 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒, appear around 400,000 years ago. But if the anatomical changes began over 1 million years before that, we may have to consider that cooking, or at least the use of heat to soften food, predates permanent hearths. Temporary fire use, opportunistic cooking over natural fires, or even roasting in burning landscapes might have served as early forms of food transformation long before controlled fire became routine. There are also other possible explanations. Some researchers point to meat eating itself, regardless of cooking, as a driver of smaller guts and larger brains. Meat is energy-dense and easier to digest than raw plant matter. Others argue that technological changes, such as stone tools for slicing and pounding food, could have reduced the mechanical demands of chewing, and it's possible that a combination of these factors, all slowly co-evolving, led to the Homo body we inherited. What's striking, though, is that unlike many traits shaped by evolution, this one feels so deeply cultural. Fire, and the act of cooking, lies at the intersection of biology and behaviour. It's not a fossil you can hold. It's a habit that left its trace in anatomy. When we find the skull of Homo erectus, we may be holding the downstream consequence of 1 million small meals, each just a little softer, warmer and more digestible than the one before. And so perhaps the most intimate evidence of fire is not in ash pits or charred bones, but in the fact that we cannot easily live without it. Our jaws no longer match a raw diet. Our guts have downsized. Our brains need more fuel than foraging alone could have provided. We've become creatures not just of flame, but of the transformations it allowed. Whether or not fire made us human is still up for debate, but that it made us differently human, that much is harder to deny. So the next time you cook, remember, that warmth on your face, that hiss of the pan, it echoes choices made long before names or languages or cities. It echoes a shift not just in how we lived, but in what we became. There are gaps in every story, but some silences feel louder than others, and in the long, flickering timeline of fire and humanity, one of the loudest silences arrives between 500,000 and 300,000 years ago. A time when early humans roamed widely across Europe, Africa, and Asia. And yet, oddly, their fires seem to go missing, not extinguished, just strangely absent from the layers of earth we've come to expect them in. But was the fire truly gone? Or is this just one more trick of the archaeological record? a whisper lost between the rocks. To understand this absence, we need to confront a fundamental flaw in how we study the past. Archaeology is not the recovery of history. It is the recovery of what survived. The fires that once blazed in open-air campsites, forest clearings, or grassland bivouacs did not always leave a mark. Charcoal blows away. Ash dissolves in water. Burned bones crumble like pastry. And all it takes is a bit of wind, a season of rain, or a few 100,000 years of shifting sediment to erase the glow. So when we look into this window of time, a stretch of 200,000 years where deliberate fire use becomes strangely hard to find, we must tread carefully. Silence is not the same as absence. Still, the gap is real. In dozens of sites across multiple continents, hominin fossils and tools show up in abundance, but traces of controlled fire do not. This has long puzzled researchers. If humans had already begun using fire in some regions before this period, why is there such a wide interval where the signal seems to vanish? One explanation is taphonomy, the processes by which organisms decay and fossilize. Fire, being ephemeral and sensitive to environment, does not fossilize easily, especially not in mobile foraging cultures that might have moved camps frequently or cooked in less sheltered locations. The early Pleistocene landscape was rarely a fireproof filing cabinet. It was more like a weathered diary. Pages torn out by erosion, smudged by rain, rewritten by rivers. But there's another possibility. Maybe fire wasn't always a priority. Or maybe, more intriguingly, it wasn't always available. In particularly humid or wet environments, fire started from lightning strikes would be rare, and kindling might be harder to dry. If groups had not yet mastered the ability to make fire from scratch, if they were still dependent on natural sources, then this would have introduced long periods where fire simply couldn't be sustained. Especially in the absence of dung-based, slow-burning fuels or portable embers, many early hominins may have been playing a waiting game. No spark, no warmth, just stone, bone and patience. The missing fire problem, then, may not be an archaeological mystery. It may be a behavioural one. A window into how precarious the relationship between hominins and fire still was. If you can't create it, and if the weather won't deliver it, you revert. You wait, you adapt. You learn to store fat instead of cooking it. You seek caves instead of kindling. You insulate with skins instead of flame. All of these strategies are archaeologically more visible than a burned stick or a shallow ash pit. And yet they say just as much about what these creatures were up against, and what they had not yet solved. Some researchers suggest this gap reveals fire's fragility in early hominin culture. It wasn't yet ritual, it wasn't yet mastered, it was a borrowed tool, not an owned one. And just like a borrowed flame, it could go out, with no way to relight it. If this is true, then we may need to reconsider the romantic image of early fire as a steady glowing companion. For hundreds of thousands of years it may have been more like a rare visitor, treasured but fleeting. The gap also reminds us of the importance of caution in narrative. We often want history to follow a clean arc. First we fear the fire, then we keep it, then we master it. But evolution rarely plays by our storytelling rules. It stutters, loops, collapses, and fire, like any other element in the story of us, was never guaranteed. It may have disappeared and reappeared many times before finally taking hold. In the end, this silence is not an error to fix. It's a lesson in humility, a reminder that not every absence is a failure of science. Some are simply reflections of time's erosion, and in those absences there is still knowledge, still data, still the haunting question: how many fires burned in places we will never see? And what did they mean to the hands that held them? And if there was one flame somewhere in that quiet stretch of time, a flame that did not go out, that was carried, nurtured, hidden, and passed on, then perhaps this silence isn't a void. It's a corridor. One we walk through every time we strike a match and forget what it meant to go without. But even before we confront the silence, we have to ask, what exactly are we listening for? Not all evidence of fire looks like fire. A hearth leaves no chimney. An ember trail leaves no signpost. Sometimes, what archaeologists find is neither flame nor ash, but the faint chemical echoes that fire once passed through. Magnetic anomalies in soil, trace elements of carbonized plant matter, mineral alterations invisible to the naked eye. These are not campfires we would recognise, they are ghosts in the dirt. And yet, for periods between 500,000 and 300,000 years ago, even those ghosts grow rare. This is why the missing fire isn't just a gap in evidence, it's a gap in presence. And it raises a more unsettling possibility, that fire may have been lost, not once, but many times. Perhaps early hominins didn't pass the knowledge on. Perhaps the knowledge was never fully there to begin with. Perhaps it lived in habits, not instructions, and when the habit failed, the spark did too. And so we are left with the haunting question. What does it mean to lose fire? Maybe it means nothing at all. Maybe it reflects only the natural rhythm of a species still learning to manage flame without truly mastering it. In the same way tool use appeared, vanished and re-emerged across different populations, fire might have flickered through the early human timeline like a fragile experiment. It didn't spread overnight. It wasn't instantly transformative. It was tentative, provisional, just another force, like water or wind, that early humans worked around rather than with. Or maybe it means everything. Maybe the absence of fire tells us more about early hominin vulnerability than any hand axe or tooth fragment ever could. Because to go without fire, especially in colder or more dangerous habitats, meant relying on other strategies entirely. Muscle, memory, shelter, fat reserves and close kin. When the light went out, what was left was each other. And here we reach the edge of what archaeology can offer. Because in these fireless layers of the past, we're not just dealing with an absence of artefacts. We're dealing with the limits of inference. Without burned bones or soot layers, we don't get stories. We get silence. And that silence demands interpretation, not just analysis. It requires us to step back, not just dig deeper. That's where the script continues, and where the full segment above picks up, tracing how absence misleads, how preservation bias distorts, and why sometimes, in the history of fire, the most meaningful part is what didn't burn. There's a moment in the archaeological record when fire begins to stay put. Not just flickering through a campsite and fading, not just a scatter of blackened seeds or a patch of oxidized clay, but something more deliberate. Fire becomes habitual, recurrent, localized. It returns to the same spot again and again, leaving ash in layers thick enough to read like pages, and something subtle shifts around it. It is no longer just a tool. It begins to behave more like a place. Around 300,000 years ago, in caves across the Mediterranean basin, hearths begin to appear with a quiet regularity. They're not yet kilns or ovens. They're not surrounded by walls or marked with carvings, but they're consistent. They are reused. They are central. Ash piles grow where feet have stood before. Burned bones gather in familiar arcs, and stone tools, sometimes discarded, sometimes resharpened, begin to cluster around this simple presence. Heat in the dark. We don't know if it was deliberate, but we do know it was different. At Tabun Cave in Israel, Bolomor in Spain, and other Middle Paleolithic sites scattered along the coasts of what would become southern Europe and the Levant, archaeologists have traced this slow, stubborn pattern. Not fire as survival, fire as anchor. Its purpose no longer limited to cooking or deterring predators, but perhaps something deeper, something ambient, something that pulled early humans closer to one another. There is reason to believe that by this time, the human day was already changing. Our sleep cycles, not unlike those of other primates, had likely adapted to respond to the threat of night. But in firelight, the threat changed shape. Darkness no longer necessarily meant danger, it meant possibility, a place to talk, to rest, to stay still. And so, if we follow the ashes closely, it's possible we're seeing not just evidence of fire, but of time, of extended evenings, of hours reclaimed from fear. Some researchers, like Polly Wiesner and Richard Wrangham, have suggested that firelight may have extended the human experience into something new, shared attention. Around a hearth, there is no hunt, no foraging, no need to watch the trail or scan for movement. There is just us. And so it is possible that here, for the first time, the human voice began to stretch beyond the practical. Language, still limited, still growing, might have started to do something strange. It might have started to tell stories. Of course, there's no direct evidence for that. No fossilised bedtime tale, no charred punchline. But the behavioural archaeology suggests a change not in what was burned, but in why they stayed. The hearths grow larger, more organised. The debris around them becomes less scattered, more social. Food waste, tools, bedding, all clustering in a familiar configuration. As if, over time, the hearth had become not just the centre of the cave, but the centre of something else entirely. Maybe of culture. We will never know the first joke told beside a fire. We'll never hear the first lie, the first myth, the first story told not to inform but to soothe. But what we do see is the outline, the footprint of attention. Fire allowed early humans to stop moving, not just their bodies, but their minds. And in stillness, imagination tends to appear. Whether it brought comfort, connection, or simply a break from the day's exhaustion, fire became a place where something more than survival could briefly flicker into being. And maybe that's the real beginning of society. Not the hunt, not the tool, not even the meal. But the pause, the circle, the unspoken agreement to sit together in the light. Next comes the question that inevitably follows any long evening. Who kept the fire going, and how? Let me know when you're ready to continue. But there's something else that lingers in these fire traces. Not just the pattern of sitting still, but the possibility of waiting. And waiting for an early human was not an idle act. It meant a kind of trust in the fire, in the group, and in the promise that tomorrow might come again. In a world full of predators, cold nights, and vanishing prey, this trust wasn't instinctive. It was learned, maybe even taught. Perhaps that's the real secret buried in the ash. Patience. The ability to stay. Modern hunter-gatherer societies that still use fire communally give us glimpses of what this could have looked like. In places like the Kalahari or the forests of Papua New Guinea, fire remains not just a physical resource, but a psychological anchor. It draws people close, slows the rhythm of action, and opens a space where silence is not empty, it's shared. These echoes, while not direct analogues, offer cautious insight into what fire may have meant before history was written down. A warm reprieve, a kind of flickering companionship, a way to be together without having to be productive. In the archaeological layers, we start to see more complex spatial behaviour. At Bollamore Cave, for instance, the fire was not randomly placed. It was consistently rebuilt in the same area of the cave. Surrounding it are concentrations of charred animal bone, some with cut marks, not scattered but clustered, suggesting a pattern of behaviour that goes beyond mere survival. Maybe it was designated space, or perhaps it was just a habit, passed on, mimicked, repeated. But either way, it speaks of memory, of a kind of informal tradition that doesn't require language, only imitation and repetition. It's this repetition that catches the attention of researchers, because it hints at the idea of instruction, not through words necessarily, but through modelling, through the act of doing something the same way, again and again, until someone else does it too. Fire might have been the first thing that invited that kind of transmission. Not a physical object, not a gesture or a tool, but a process, a rhythm, something that had to be tended, monitored, anticipated. Fire disappears if neglected, so it must be remembered, which means someone had to be watching, learning, maybe even teaching. And what of the embers themselves? We often imagine prehistoric fire as roaring flames, dramatic bursts of light in otherwise pitch-black caves. But most of the time, a hearth was likely little more than a glowing bed of coals, smouldering, controlled, not showy, but steady. Enough to give off warmth, but not so much as to smoke out a cave. Enough to cook meat slowly, to ward off insects, to suggest a presence, without shouting it. That low, persistent glow may have done more than we think. It could have recalibrated our internal clocks. Firelight extends the evening, but it also shifts the perception of night itself. With artificial light, even something as primitive as a few flickering flames, the boundaries of the day change. We begin to separate waking hours from working hours. Sleep becomes something that can be delayed, perhaps even shortened. And in that delay, cognition fills the space. The mind, no longer preoccupied with immediate needs, begins to wander. The connection between fire and circadian rhythm isn't just speculation. Studies of modern lighting patterns show that even dim light can impact melatonin levels and influence sleep cycles. Some researchers believe that firelight may have gradually helped reshape early human chronobiology, nudging our species toward consolidated nighttime sleep and a more structured daily rhythm. In other words, fire may have been the first clock we ever lived by, not in ticks and tocks, but in slow-burning cues that taught us when to rest and when to rise. And with routine comes expectation. One of the quiet revolutions of fire was not technological, but temporal. It let us plan. When a hearth is kept alive through the night, there is a tomorrow implied. You don't maintain a fire for the moment, you do it for later, and that simple act of anticipating a future might be among the earliest behavioural signs of what we call foresight. A uniquely human trait, perhaps kindled by flame. Still, for all these possibilities, there's no direct proof that early fire was used for storytelling, music, or ritual. There are no preserved narratives from 300,000 years ago, but what we do find, again and again, is the remains of repetition. Sites with multiple occupation layers, fires that were rebuilt in the same places, scorched earth that slowly deepened into hearth pits. These aren't spectacular discoveries. They're slow ones, the kind you almost overlook, but they suggest a transformation far greater than any single spark. They point to continuity, and continuity is culture, however quiet. So we return to the question, was the hearth our first living room? Maybe. Or maybe it was something deeper, not a room, but a rhythm, a heartbeat. A low, glowing anchor in a world of sudden shifts and wandering predators. Fire gave us heat, yes, but it also gave us pause. It offered a reason to stop, to sit, to look at each other. And in doing so, it may have given us the first outlines of community, not just as a survival strategy, but as a shared experience. It's tempting to draw a straight line from these early hearths to the domestic warmth we imagine today. Campfires, fireplaces, dinner tables. But the truth is probably more ambiguous. Early humans didn't think of fire as cosy. They may not have thought of it at all in the abstract sense. They simply lived near it. And over time, living near it changed them, not in grand mythic ways, but in small ones. A minute more of rest, a moment less of fear, a slightly longer silence between the day's tasks, and in those spaces something else began to form. Maybe not language, maybe not myth, but the room for both. The next step, though, would require something else, not just tending fire, but making it. Let me know when you're ready to strike that next spark. There's something primal about the dark. Not the dark of nightfall, where a moon softens the black, or the dark of closed eyes in a safe room, but the kind of absolute dark that caves are built to contain. The kind of dark that does not let you see your own hands, that offers no horizon, no direction, and no mercy. It's the kind of dark where time erodes, sound flattens, the body cools. You're not supposed to be there, and yet someone was. 300,000 years ago, deep beneath the surface of what we now call the Rising Star cave system in South Africa, something burned. Not outside, not near the entrance, but in narrow passageways and death-silent chambers. Bone-black soot painted ceilings, burnt bone fragments, some calcined, some split from heat, lay scattered where only the dead once seemed to belong. But this was not the work of any creature we had expected. This was not Homo sapiens. This was not even Homo erectus. This was something smaller, stranger, and for a long time dismissed. Homo naledi entered the scene like a whisper with teeth. First discovered in the early 21st century in the Naledi chamber, this hominin was unlike the rest. It had a small brain, roughly a third the size of ours, long curved fingers, a mix of primitive and modern traits that made it hard to place on any clean evolutionary ladder. And yet, it had apparently done something that until recently we had reserved for ourselves. It had entered the pitch. It had gone deep. It had perhaps buried its dead. And now, it seems, it may have brought fire. For almost a decade, the idea that Homo naledi might have controlled fire was treated with hesitation. Their cranial capacity was simply too low, the argument went. Fire use required planning, communication, perhaps even some form of symbolic thought. These were the markers of more modern minds. The minds of Neanderthals, of sapiens, of those who had already spread far and developed toolkits dense with intention. Naledi had no such signature. It had no adornments, no carvings, no weapons of note. Its world, as far as we could tell, was one of shadows. But then someone looked up. In 2 separate cave systems, Naledi and Hill Antechamber, teams began documenting extensive blackening along the cave walls and ceilings. This was not manganese staining or random mineral intrusion. This was soot. Fine, powdery, carbon-based residue clinging to the rock, and alongside it, bones. Animal bones, some cracked, some scorched, bearing the unmistakable colorations of controlled heat. In other words, this was not a wildfire's reach. It was not a lightning strike nor the aftermath of volcanic ash. This was local, intentional, protected, and sustained. What made the discovery even more perplexing was the nature of the chambers themselves. The Naledi chamber, for instance, lies beyond a perilously narrow vertical chute, requiring modern humans to shed gear, twist sideways, and navigate sharp drops in almost total blackness. This is not a place light finds on its own. The same can be said for Hill Antechamber, which lies beyond passages that would have challenged even the most agile primates. No predator would have chased prey into such a trap. No scavenger would have lingered. Something else brought those bones in. Something with persistence, and possibly flame. So what does this mean? First, it invites a re-evaluation of what we mean by intelligence. The brain of Homo naledi may have been smaller, but that does not equate to simpler. Evidence from birds, octopuses, and even some primates suggests that behavioural complexity does not always scale directly with brain volume. It's possible, even likely, that cognitive architecture matters more than sheer size. And if Naledi had, in fact, learned to transport fire, maintain embers, or even ignite flame through frictional sparks, then the bar for cognitive sophistication might need a serious adjustment. Second, it forces us to look again at the deep timeline of fire. Much of our fire chronology assumes a march toward mastery, from opportunistic use by Homo erectus, to sustained hearths by Heidelbergensis, to full domestication by sapiens. But the rising star evidence suggests a parallel thread, one where a different hominin, with no clear cultural connection to us, was learning the same lesson. Maybe not the same way, maybe not for the same reasons, but learning it nonetheless. Fire, in this view, was not a single conquest. It was a kind of evolutionary theme, one that multiple species heard and hummed back in their own keys. Third, and perhaps most uncomfortably, it raises the question of what else we've missed. The archaeology of caves is notoriously difficult. Soot can wash away, burnt bone can degrade, and smaller-bodied hominins tend to leave lighter footprints, both literally and culturally. If Homo naledi used fire and we only just noticed, what else did they do that escaped our vision? What rituals, what forms of care, what adaptations have been crushed under rockfall or lost to moisture, simply because we did not expect to find them? Of course, caution is still warranted. Not all scholars are convinced. Some argue that the soot may have drifted in from above. Others note the absence of clear hearth structures or stone fire tools in the immediate vicinity. But the growing pattern, across multiple chambers, with multiple types of burned material, is becoming difficult to explain away, especially when paired with the anatomical evidence that Naledi was, in fact, navigating those chambers deliberately. There is movement here, and possibly light. It's hard not to be haunted by the image. A small-brained hominin, hunched in a cave that modern humans would find terrifying, feeding a flicker of flame, not for ceremony, not for show, but perhaps for warmth, or light, or simply to keep the dark from winning. No language, no gods, just an ember in the palm of something almost us. That kind of moment doesn't just rewrite chapters, it humbles them, and maybe that's the real fire. Not the flame itself, but what it forces us to reckon with. How easily we confuse simplicity with inferiority. How often we place intelligence on pedestals shaped like ourselves. Homo naledi may never have built cities, may never have farmed, or sailed, or carved symbols into stone, but they may have kindled light in the dark, and if that's true, then the fire we thought we carried alone was already flickering in other hands, quietly, carefully, before we even knew to ask. You don't need to make fire to need it. Sometimes it's enough just to keep it breathing. 300,000 years ago, in the recesses of South Africa's subterranean landscape, a species we once thought too primitive may have been doing just that. Not striking sparks or conjuring flame from flint, but something quieter, harder, more essential. They may have been preserving it, sheltering it, learning not how to start fire, but how not to let it die. And if you think about it, that might be the harder skill. For Homo naledi, the world above ground was already strange. They had emerged with a peculiar mosaic of traits, part ancestral, part surprisingly modern, yet with a cranial volume closer to a gorilla than a human. Their hands were built for climbing, but their feet walked upright. Their teeth were suited for a broad diet, but their tools, if they used any, left barely a trace. And still, it seems, they moved in darkness with purpose. Not panic, not escape. Purpose. But let's take a step back. Because before we ask whether an Naledi could make fire, we have to ask something simpler. Could they have known what fire was? And if so, what does that mean? Knowing fire is not just about flame. It's about heat gradients. It's about smoke irritation. It's about risk and opportunity balanced in every flicker. To carry a coal, to shield an ember, to feed a dying flame at dawn. These are not just acts of reaction. They are acts of care. They require foresight, context, a rudimentary concept of future needs, not invention, intention. Some archaeologists have begun looking for precisely that kind of subtle behaviour. Not stone-strike kits or elaborate pyrotechnics, but signs that Homo naledi may have tended to fire the way one tends to a child. Not always understanding how it came to be, but instinctively knowing it must not be allowed to go out. Charcoal in protected alcoves, burnt bone mixed with ash, layered as if through repeated visits, even the possibility of dung as fuel. A slow, steady source that does not flash or crackle, but glows, sustaining warmth through the long hours of cave dark. Dung. Not the sort of detail that makes it into myth, but then again, Naledi's story was never going to be clean. Dung-based fire maintenance is not modern improvisation. It's a known technique, used in arid regions even today. Camel dung, cow dung, dry, easy to carry, slow to burn. If Homo naledi had discovered this, even by accident, it would mean they were not just users of fire, but curators of it. Think about that. A creature with a brain no larger than a grapefruit, managing combustion with more precision than panic. That's not instinct. That's learning. And where there's learning, there's memory. And maybe transmission. This is where things get uncomfortable for traditional models of cognition. Because if Naledi could pass on fire-tending skills, even through demonstration or proximity, it suggests some form of cultural continuity. Not language, not story, not law, but precedent, repetition. The kind of knowledge that survives because it works, not because it's understood. And in evolutionary terms, that's huge. We often tie innovation to intellect. But preservation is its own kind of genius. To inherit a burning branch, to walk it back into the cave without extinguishing it, to lay it carefully, to add dry moss or bark shavings or dung. This is not the kind of thing that happens once. It's the kind of thing that must be remembered, and more importantly taught, clumsily perhaps, wordlessly, but taught. And if Naledi could teach fire, what else could they teach? That question, for now, remains open. But the fire part is looking less like fantasy and more like quiet reality. No flashy hearths, no soot-filled murals, no scorched tools or pit-stained enclosures, just the steady accumulation of evidence that a small-brained hominin moved through darkness with a light of its own, not because it had mastered fire, but because it hadn't let it go out. And maybe that's the real threshold, the one that matters more than invention. The moment we stopped fleeing from fire and started walking beside it, not because we could create it, but because we had learned how to keep it alive. That lesson, perhaps more than any other, shaped who we would eventually become. And for Homo naledi, still unknown, still unfinished, it may be the one clue that shows just how close they really got. The path to fire mastery might not be blazed in sudden bursts of invention, but in the long quiet act of not letting the flame die between generations. That, more than any isolated moment of spark making, might be the foundation of what fire meant to our ancestors. And if we extend this line of thinking, careful, cautious, grounded in the archaeological record, it becomes harder to exclude Homo naledi from the lineage of firekeepers simply because their brain was small, or their behaviours don't fit our projections of what early intelligence should look like. Consider what it takes to manage fire in a space like the Rising Star cave system. This was not an open-air environment where flames could be easily fanned or replenished. It was a maze of narrow corridors, difficult for modern humans to traverse even with specialised gear. If Naledi moved fire through these channels, whether by torch, ember bundle or burning dung, they were doing something we rarely credit to archaic hominins, navigating in darkness with intention. That alone implies a working familiarity with combustion's properties, including oxygen needs, smoke behaviour, and fuel durability. We're not talking about a single episode of fire use, we're talking about repeated behaviour, evidence of ash, layers of soot on ceilings, burnt bones found in spaces too deep for light to naturally reach. It's not just the presence of fire, it's its recurrence, in spaces where nothing should burn unless deliberately brought there. If Naledi were scavenging naturally occurring fires from lightning or savanna burns, those fires would still need to be transported, shielded from wind, fed with the right fuel and tended with consistency. No simple feat. And yet, there's more. One of the more subtle but telling pieces of this puzzle is thermal constraint. Fire, when poorly managed, isn't just dangerous, it's wasteful. Excess heat consumes fuel too quickly. Poor ventilation smothers flame or fills a chamber with smoke. To control fire without killing it, Naledi would have had to learn balance. Perhaps through trial and error, certainly without abstract planning, but still, balance. This starts to resemble something more complex than instinct. Not quite symbolic, not necessarily reflective in the modern sense, but procedural, something that approximates a tradition, and traditions are what cultures are built from. To be clear, we're still guessing. The evidence is there, but it's fragmentary. Soot can be deposited from many sources. Burnt bone can occur in surface fires that later collapse into deeper spaces. Dung as fuel is speculative, though plausible. But when we pull the thread of all this evidence together, the soot, the location, the repetition, the cognitive implications, it becomes harder to deny that something fire-related was happening with Naledi. Something intentional. And yet, the most fascinating part may not be whether they made fire or not. It's the idea that making it from scratch may not have mattered as much as we think. Because to preserve fire, to keep it alive through cold nights, to share it across individuals and time, that's cultural power. That's survival, not just intelligence. It also reframes how we define mastery. Maybe fire didn't need to be invented in the traditional sense. Maybe it just needed to be seen, noticed, valued, and held onto. That vision shifts the whole narrative of human prehistory. We often imagine breakthroughs as eureka moments. Stone strikes spark, spark catches kindling, humanity begins. But more likely it was incremental, accumulative. Watching a log smoulder, testing which materials flare and which don't. Realising that a glowing ember buried in ash survives till morning, that dry dung catches slowly and burns without drama, that certain fungi smoulder better than twigs, and slowly over generations these fragments become familiarity, and familiarity becomes tradition, and tradition, given enough time and continuity, becomes knowledge. In this version of history, Naledi fits in just fine, not as inventors, not as sparks of sudden genius, but as quiet participants in the great shared experiment of fire. Their story, if confirmed, reminds us that cognition doesn't always wear a human face, that culture doesn't always require language, that caretaking can emerge from unexpected minds, and maybe, just maybe, that the first hominin to truly understand fire wasn't us. Somewhere between the spark and the story, fire became more than a tool, and we don't know when that shift happened. Not exactly. But at some point the flames we gathered for warmth began to carry something else. Memory maybe, or meaning. Not quite religion, not yet mythology, but something leaning in that direction. A drift. A shadow in the mind cast by smoke. By 300,000 years ago, anatomically modern humans, or near-modern variants, had begun to appear across parts of Africa and the Levant. They were not living in cities, they had no pottery, no written language, and no fixed agriculture. But they had campsites and hearths, and places they came back to again and again, sometimes to live, sometimes to bury their dead. In caves like Border Cave in South Africa and Mislia in Israel, blackened layers of ash and repeated fire use zones start to pile up, literally. Charcoal layers become archaeological timekeepers. In Tabun and School, signs of burning appear not just where people lived, but also in direct association with burials. Were these ceremonial fires, cooking fires near graves, accidents of long habitation? We can't say for certain, but something about fire at this point in time begins to move out of the purely practical. It's worth pausing here. For most of human prehistory, fire was functional. You didn't survive a cold night on the savannah without it. You didn't cook tubers or fend off predators, or make durable tools unless you learned to feed a flame and keep it alive. But as groups settled into familiar territories, revisited the same shelters, and spent more time in proximity to each other, fire's role seems to have stretched, quietly, almost invisibly, into something social, then maybe something emotional. We don't have evidence of storytelling carved into stone, no early cave paintings yet, no firelit art scenes, but we do see patterns of fire placement. Hearths not just scattered, but centralised, layers of ash forming over time in specific areas, reused again and again. That alone might not seem symbolic, but think of what it means behaviourally. A preference for placing fire in the same location. A repeated choice, perhaps not consciously ritual, but habitual in a meaningful way. Fire stops being transient. It becomes anchored, and once something is anchored, it becomes easier to return to remember. The hearth becomes the centre of the camp, and eventually, maybe, the centre of the mind. We can speculate, but only carefully, that such repetition allowed early humans to associate fire with more than just warmth, with security, with familiarity, possibly with loss. If a fire burns where someone died, and is tended by those who remember them, does it become a kind of memorial, even if no words are spoken? Or perhaps the opposite. A way to distract from grief. A place where light replaces the dark. Some researchers have noted the unusual presence of fire residues near what appear to be intentional burials. In 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒, dated to around 100,000 years ago, grave sites show signs of ochre use, shell ornaments, and repeated fire activity in nearby layers. This has led some to argue that we may be seeing the first glimmers of symbolic ritual, not just burying the dead, but doing so with objects, colour, and possibly fire. Again, none of this is definitive, but it's suggestive, and the suggestion alone tells us how far we've come from the opportunistic fire use of early Homo erectus. Even if these fires were not rituals in the way we understand the word today, they were no longer accidental. They belonged to spaces that mattered. The idea that a fire could mean something more than heat might not come from the flame itself, but from the place it lit. A hearth that you return to, that your children see you tend, that your group comes to expect. This becomes a kind of shared memory, a focal point, a silent signal that says, this is where we live, and maybe this is where we remember. At some point, the flicker of flame in the dark stopped being only a survival strategy. It became part of the atmosphere of the mind, not symbolic in the modern sense, but ambient, a kind of ambient significance. Think of what happens to your thoughts when you stare into a fire. You drift. Your sense of time changes. The world outside the light shrinks, and your internal world expands. Is it possible that even early humans, huddled around a low blaze, experienced something similar? Not introspection in the modern sense, but a kind of cognitive deceleration. A lowering of the guard, a space to feel. The fire was no longer just reacting to the environment, it was helping to shape it, socially, emotionally, maybe even spiritually. But all we see is ash, so we look at the residue. We measure the blackening of ceilings, the carbon in bones, the spread of hearths across cave floors, and we guess. We don't know when the hearth became a metaphor, but the fact that we keep wondering about it suggests that, on some level, it already was. What's striking is that none of this required dramatic innovation. No new tools, no abstract art, just the slow, repeated act of returning to flame, and what that flame came to represent in a shared space. Belonging, warmth, loss, hope, or maybe just quiet. The question is not whether early humans were symbolically burning things. It's whether, by burning things over and over in the same places, they began to create meaning, accidentally, experientially, inevitably. And if fire began to carry meaning before we ever carved it into walls or sang about it around flickering logs, then maybe the first story wasn't spoken. Maybe it was simply tended. Not written, but fed with twigs. Not told, but felt. The shadow of smoke still lingers in us. Even now a campfire draws us into circles. We fall quiet around it. We remember. We reflect. And perhaps for a very long time before we even had words for it, so did they. Somewhere along the southern African coast, tens of thousands of years before pottery or farming, someone lit a fire that wasn't meant to warm a body, or cook a root, or drive off predators in the night. It was meant to transform stone, not to break it, to perfect it. The flames didn't cook food, they cooked tools, and the act was not survival, but strategy. At Pinnacle Point, perched above the rugged sea cliffs near what is now Mossel Bay, archaeologists uncovered layers of heat-altered silcrete stone. Silcrete, a tough sedimentary rock rich in silica, is not an ideal candidate for shaping when found in its raw form. It fractures unpredictably, resists fine control, and bruises easily under pressure. But something changes when it's heated. Its structure tightens, its fracture patterns stabilise, and it becomes, essentially, better to work with. This transformation is not accidental, and it marks one of the earliest known uses of pyrotechnology. Deliberate heat, applied not for necessity but for enhancement. These burned silcrete cores, dated to around 160,000 years ago, suggest that early Homo sapiens, yes, anatomically modern humans, had learned not just to contain fire but to wield it with foresight. The people of Pinnacle Point were not simply throwing stones into the fire and noticing a happy accident. They were placing their raw toolstone in the embers and then returning later to shape it. This means planning. It means memory. And it may mean something more unnerving to admit, a form of material intelligence more advanced than we often credit to humans of that time. Let's pause for a second. This isn't about fire as an abstract symbol. It's not about mythology or group bonding or burial ritual. This is fire as a technology, as a process, a step taken not for spiritual comfort but for practical gain. And this step is not obvious. Unlike the flicker of light in darkness or the sizzle of roasted meat, the improvement of a stone's fracture pattern is invisible until tested. It must be learned through trial, through mistake, and it must be remembered and taught. Controlled heating of silcrete is delicate work. Heat it too quickly, and the stone may crack. Too low, and nothing changes. Researchers replicating the process today have demonstrated that silcrete needs to be held at specific temperatures, between 300 and 400 degrees Celsius, for hours at a time. This requires insulation, temperature regulation, and patience. In other words, it requires more than just fire. It requires understanding, and then comes the chipping. Post-heating, the nappers at Pinnacle Point produced elongated blades with smooth, predictable flake scars, superior to what could be achieved from unheated cores. These tools would have been sharper, more durable, and easier to haft. But more than that, they represented a shift in mindset, not just reacting to nature, but shaping it, not just using what the environment gave, but modifying it to human terms. Other nearby sites, like Blombos Cave and Klipdrift Shelter, also show signs of heat-treated stone tools dating from roughly 70,000 to 100,000 years ago. Across the region, this behaviour wasn't isolated, it was cultural. Pyrotechnology, true pyrotechnology, was spreading. Now fire itself is ancient. But fire used with this level of specificity? This may be the tipping point where flame stopped being simply an environmental edge and became a system, a repeatable, transferable craft. These early humans weren't just surviving, they were engineering. It's also worth noting what this isn't. It's not metallurgy. No ores were melted, no kilns constructed, and it's not ceramic. no pots hardened. The materials were still stone, and the lifestyle still forager, but the implications run deep. Heat treatment of stone prefigures a mental toolkit of experimentation, temperature control and transformation that would eventually fuel metallurgy, pottery, and chemistry itself. These were not crude brutes fumbling with sparks. These were patient experimenters, tending embers, testing materials, and passing down their findings without ever writing a word. Some have argued that these heating techniques were accidental, that stones fell into the fire and people simply noticed they flaked better afterward. Maybe, but once is accident, twice is chance. A region-wide pattern spanning millennia is something else. It is memory, encoded through behaviour, and it is intention, hidden in heat. Interestingly, the archaeological record here flips a popular assumption. We often think of tool innovation as something that comes first, and fire control as something that supports it. But in this case, fire was the tool. The innovation came through the flame, not beside it. This wasn't about sharper spears or fancier scrapers. It was about treating stone as a material that could be enhanced, like cooking, but for the hand instead of the stomach. And what's most remarkable is that this use of fire is invisible at first glance. There are no grand hearths preserved in neat circles, no dramatic layers of ash to photograph in cross-section. The clues are hidden inside the stone itself, in altered mineral structures, changes in fracture mechanics, and thermoluminescent signatures that whisper of hours-long exposure to heat. What we see looking back is a quiet revolution, not one marked by new species or sudden tools, but by temperature and time, by a change in how early humans thought about stone and fire and the space between them. A hearth that cooked tools is a hearth that asked a question. What if the material world could be improved? And that question didn't end at the edge of a flake. It burned deeper. The haunting part is this. There are no texts, no records, no oral histories of these breakthroughs. The fire left ash, the tools left scars, but the minds behind them are gone. All we have is evidence of care, of waiting, of someone somewhere, feeding fuel into a slow, steady fire. Not to stay alive, but to do something better. And that means, at least once in deep prehistory, fire was trusted not just to warm the night, but to reshape the future. If you were holding a stick in the dark, knowing it was the only thing standing between you and something with claws sharper than your thoughts, would you think to put it in the fire? Not to burn it, but to make it stronger. Somewhere between 400,000 and 200,000 years ago, someone did exactly that. Not in theory, not in imagination, but in a damp forest, probably in what we now call Germany, where water softened the ground and survival was measured in proximity to sharpness, warmth and instinct. At the Schöningen site in Lower Saxony, archaeologists recovered what may be the oldest known wooden weapons, spears. Long, pointed, aerodynamically balanced, and one of them had been sharpened with fire. This wasn't a casual accident of flame, it was deliberate thermal engineering, carried out by minds that understood what fire did to wood, and how controlled burning could change not just the world, but the material logic of a hunt. If you were holding a stick in the dark, knowing it was the only thing standing between you and something with claws sharper than your thoughts, would you think to put it in the fire? Not to burn it, but to make it stronger. Somewhere between 400,000 and 200,000 years ago, someone did exactly that. Not in theory, not in imagination, but in a damp forest, probably in what we now call Germany, where water softened the ground, and survival was measured in proximity to sharpness, warmth and instinct. At the Schöningen site in Lower Saxony, archaeologists recovered what may be the oldest known wooden weapons, spears. Long, pointed, aerodynamically balanced, and one of them had been sharpened with fire. This wasn't a casual accident of flame, it was deliberate thermal engineering, carried out by minds that understood what fire did to wood, and how controlled burning could change not just the world, but the material logic of a hunt. The evidence came slowly. First the spears themselves, smooth-shaped branches from spruce trees, meticulously crafted and balanced with the heavier end at the front. This wasn't crude kindling. This was technological intention. Then came the microscopic analysis of char and the tapered tips, altered in structure by exposure to heat. The result? a stronger, stiffer, and far deadlier tool than green wood could provide. Fire had met the hunt, not as a torch, but as a craftsman. The evidence came slowly. First the spears themselves, smooth, shaped branches from spruce trees meticulously crafted and balanced with the heavier end at the front. This wasn't crude kindling. This was technological intention. Then came the microscopic analysis of char and the tapered tips, altered in structure by exposure to heat. The result? A stronger, stiffer, and far deadlier tool than green wood could provide. Fire had met the hunt, not as a torch, but as a craftsman. Who made them? Likely Homo Heidelbergensis, though certainty is a rare privilege in this corner of time. Whoever it was, they didn't just throw sharpened sticks. They engineered them. The shaping of the spear required drying, trimming, fire exposure, and abrasion. In stages, not all at once. That matters. Because multi-stage tool production implies more than trial and error. It suggests planning, memory, maybe even teaching. It also implies time spent near fire, not just as an occasional visitor, but as an intentional participant. And that reshapes how we think about what fire was doing in the hominin brain, not just warming the body, but lengthening the reach of thought. This wasn't the beginning of weaponry, but it was the moment when fire stopped being a backdrop and started being a partner, when we used it not just for defense but for design. And the fact that we find these hardened spears preserved in waterlogged earth, in the absence of permanent shelters or organized camps, tells us that early humans were willing to invest significant time and effort into something they'd carry for miles, and possibly lose in seconds. So the question becomes, when you bend over a fire to shape a spear, what else are you changing? Who made them? Likely Homo Heidelbergensis, though certainty is a rare privilege in this corner of time. Whoever it was, they didn't just throw sharpened sticks, they engineered them. The shaping of the spear required drying, trimming, fire exposure, and abrasion. In stages, not all at once. That matters. Because multi-stage tool production implies more than trial and error. It suggests planning, memory, maybe even teaching. It also implies time spent near fire, not just as an occasional visitor, but as an intentional participant. And that reshapes how we think about what fire was doing in the hominin brain. Not just warming the body, but lengthening the reach of thought. This wasn't the beginning of weaponry, but it was the moment when fire stopped being a backdrop and started being a partner, when we used it not just for defense but for design. And the fact that we find these hardened spears preserved in waterlogged earth, in the absence of permanent shelters or organized camps, tells us that early humans were willing to invest significant time and effort into something they'd carry for miles, and possibly lose in seconds. So the question becomes, when you bend over a fire to shape a spear, what else are you changing? Wood, as a material, resists permanence. That's one of the reasons we know so little about the early toolkit of our ancestors. The leather, the rope, the plant fibre nets and woven containers that would have formed the texture of daily life. But fire-hardened wood gives us a rare bridge. It fossilises intention. When a sharpened spear has been held to flame and then shaped, it tells us more than how it was used. It tells us how it was thought. To harden wood with fire you need several things: the right type of fuel, patience, and knowledge of what burning too much or too little will do. You also need to know when in the construction process to apply the heat. If it's too early, the tip becomes brittle and breaks. Too late, and the shaft may warp or weaken. This isn't accidental survivalism, it's pyrotechnological finesse. This brings us to another layer of inference, one we rarely admit in archaeology. To teach someone to do this kind of work, you don't just hand them a stick and point to a flame, you likely show them, you watch, you correct, you pass down a method. The act of making a fire-hardened spear may be one of the earliest documented chains of technical knowledge passed from one generation to another, not just in stone, but in wood, ash, and memory. And there's something else. Unlike stone tools, which can be struck and shaped in near silence, fire invites presence. It smells, it moves, it casts shadows, it pulls people into shared spaces, and so when we imagine early hominins gathered around flame to make spears, we're not imagining a single action, but a constellation of them. Conversation, silence, smoke in the eyes, the scent of burnt resin. This wasn't just tool making, it was scene making. The psychological impact of this is subtle, but worth sitting with. Fire introduces a new kind of temporality. It forces you to wait, to watch, to regulate heat. Fire hardening a spear takes time, and in the span of that time something else can evolve. Patience, attention, maybe even anticipation. These are not trivial traits, they are the scaffolding of foresight, and if we take that leap, cautiously but sincerely, we begin to see fire not just as a survival tool but as a cognitive accelerant. Not because it cooked our food or protected us from predators, but because it demanded something in return. Discipline, coordination, focus. Fire didn't just burn brighter, it made our thoughts burn longer. So here in the flickering light of ancient Schöningen, the evidence is not just that someone hardened a spear, it's that someone knew how, someone taught how, and someone thought it was worth doing. Again and again. We don't know their names, we don't know their words, but we know their logic, and that logic left scorch marks in the record of time, and that leaves us once again with a haunting question. If fire helped shape the spear, did the spear in turn help shape the mind? There are things we assume every human group has always known how to do. To make a sharp edge, to find water, to make fire. But if we wind the timeline back to somewhere between 200,000 and 100,000 years ago, and trace the scattered footsteps of early Homo sapiens moving across northern Africa and into the wide corridors of Asia, the picture becomes more delicate. Because while fire appears in so many of the sites left behind by these migrating bands, there's a detail most people overlook. There's almost no clear evidence yet of anyone creating fire during this time. No fire-starting tools, no friction kits, no preserved spark stones, just flames that seem to follow them, or rather the flames that they carried. The period from 200,000 to 100,000 years ago is often imagined as the slow burn of modernity. Anatomically, modern humans had emerged, at least in part. Climate fluctuations were pushing groups to explore new edges of habitat. Grasslands and woodlands expanded and retracted like breath. And in this long pulse of movement, some groups began to stretch further than ever before. From the Nile Valley toward the Levant, across the Red Sea's southern edge, perhaps during brief windows of lower sea level, into Arabia, maybe beyond. In the footprints they left behind, archaeologists have found flakes of stone, butchered bones, and sometimes ash. But where did the fire come from? The theory many researchers now consider is not one of invention, but of preservation. That early humans, still lacking reliable means of starting fire from scratch, learned how to keep it alive instead. And that this quiet innovation of carrying and protecting flame was one of the most important skills any group could master before moving into new territory. So how do you move with fire? There are only a few options. One is to keep a flame burning continuously, an open fire at the heart of the group, never allowed to go out. Another is to carry embers, carefully insulated in a bundle of slow-burning material like dried dung, fungus, bark, or a carved-out shell filled with coals and kept fed with small twigs. Experiments with this technique have shown that embers can be kept smouldering for hours, even a full day, provided the conditions are stable. Add to that a bit of cultural memory, who tends it, who feeds it, how to revive it, and suddenly the spark becomes portable. There's ethnographic precedent for this. Among indigenous groups from Australia to North America, fire preservation was often more crucial than fire starting. Stories and taboos sometimes surrounded the act of keeping flame alive. Fire was a responsibility, one passed between elders, mothers, and firekeepers. If you lost it, you had to borrow it from another group, or wait for lightning, or sometimes pray. So when we look at early Homo sapiens migrations, the appearance of fire at site after site may not mean they were striking new sparks. It might mean someone was always carrying the old one forward. Archaeological evidence gives a few quiet hints. In sites like Jebel Erhoud in Morocco and Mislia Cave in Israel, burnt materials appear alongside stone tools and fossil remains. The layers are rich with ash, bone, and blackened earth. But there's no clear starter, no flint and pyrite, no drill, no tinderbox. Some layers seem to show repeated fire use in the same spots, suggesting not wildfires, but returning camps. In other places, burnt wood appears in isolation, perhaps as the remains of a transported fire that was allowed to die. Then there's the question of shelter. To carry fire is to shelter it. Wind can kill it. Rain can drown it. A stray ember can start an unwanted blaze. So the very act of preserving flame may have forced our ancestors to invent new forms of enclosure. Stone rings to hold coals, hollowed-out logs packed with ash, or simply a routine of returning each evening to the same burned patch, reigniting the buried embers with breath and bark. This kind of behavioural continuity leaves little to find in the fossil record, but it would have reshaped everything. The rhythm of the day, the weight of what was carried, the way groups organised sleep, rest and movement, and it likely changed how groups saw one another. If fire was scarce, it could become a reason to approach strangers, to trade, to wait, to join. A single coal might become a reason not to fight, or to do the opposite. What we begin to glimpse in this window of deep time is not yet a technological revolution, but something slower. Fire as an inheritance, fire as responsibility, fire as continuity. Before the world was mapped, before it was claimed, before the rules of agriculture and architecture and belief, there were simply people walking across uncertain land, each night making camp, someone quietly tending the coals before sleep. And each time they moved, those coals moved with them. If we're being honest, we don't know who started the fire, but we might know who protected it. Not by inventing tools or writing myths or building monuments, but simply by not letting it die. And the haunting question is this: if those embers had gone cold, would we still be here? If you were holding a stick in the dark, knowing it was the only thing standing between you and something with claws sharper than your thoughts, would you think to put it in the fire? Not to burn it, but to make it stronger? Somewhere between 400,000 and 200,000 years ago, someone did exactly that. Not in theory, not in imagination, but in a damp forest, probably in what we now call Germany, where water softened the ground and survival was measured in proximity to sharpness, warmth and instinct. At the Schöningen site in Lower Saxony, archaeologists recovered what may be the oldest known wooden weapons: spears, long, pointed, aerodynamically balanced, and one of them had been sharpened with fire. This wasn't a casual accident of flame, it was deliberate thermal engineering, carried out by minds that understood what fire did to wood and how controlled burning could change not just the world, but the material logic of a hunt. The evidence came slowly. First the spears themselves, smooth, shaped branches from spruce trees, meticulously crafted and balanced with the heavier end at the front. This wasn't crude kindling. This was technological intention. Then came the microscopic analysis of char and the tapered tips, altered in structure by exposure to heat. The result? A stronger, stiffer and far deadlier tool than green wood could provide. Fire had met the hunt, not as a torch, but as a craftsman. Who made them? Likely Homo Heidelbergensis, though certainty is a rare privilege in this corner of time. Whoever it was, they didn't just throw sharpened sticks, they engineered them. The shaping of the spear required drying, trimming, fire exposure and abrasion. In stages, not all at once. That matters, because multi-stage tool production implies more than trial and error. It suggests planning, memory, maybe even teaching. It also implies time spent near fire, not just as an occasional visitor, but as an intentional participant. And that reshapes how we think about what fire was doing in the hominin brain, not just warming the body, but lengthening the reach of thought. This wasn't the beginning of weaponry, but it was the moment when fire stopped being a backdrop and started being a partner. When we used it not just for defence, but for design. And the fact that we find these hardened spears preserved in waterlogged earth, in the absence of permanent shelters or organised camps, tells us that early humans were willing to invest significant time and effort into something they'd carry for miles, and possibly lose in seconds. So the question becomes, when you bend over a fire to shape a spear, what else are you changing? Wood, as a material, resists permanence. That's one of the reasons we know so little about the early toolkit of our ancestors, the leather, the rope, the plant fibre nets and woven containers that would have formed the texture of daily life. But fire-hardened wood gives us a rare bridge. It fossilises intention. When a sharpened spear has been held to flame and then shaped, it tells us more than how it was used. It tells us how it was thought. To harden wood with fire, you need several things: the right type of fuel, patience and knowledge of what burning too much or too little will do. You also need to know when in the construction process to apply the heat. If it's too early, the tip becomes brittle and breaks. Too late, and the shaft may warp or weaken. This isn't accidental survivalism, it's pyrotechnological finesse. This brings us to another layer of inference, one we rarely admit in archaeology. To teach someone to do this kind of work, you don't just hand them a stick and point to a flame. You likely show them, you watch, you correct, you pass down a method. The act of making a fire-hardened spear may be one of the earliest documented chains of technical knowledge passed from one generation to another, not just in stone, but in wood, ash, and memory. And there's something else. Unlike stone tools, which can be struck and shaped in near silence, fire invites presence. It smells, it moves, it casts shadows, it pulls people into shared spaces. And so when we imagine early hominins gathered around flame to make spears, we're not imagining a single action, but a constellation of them. Conversation, silence, smoke in the eyes, the scent of burnt resin. This wasn't just tool-making, it was scene-making. The psychological impact of this is subtle but worth sitting with. Fire introduces a new kind of temporality. It forces you to wait, to watch, to regulate heat. Fire hardening a spear takes time, and in the span of that time, something else can evolve. Patience, attention, maybe even anticipation. These are not trivial traits. They are the scaffolding of foresight, and if we take that leap, cautiously but sincerely, we begin to see fire not just as a survival tool, but as a cognitive accelerant. Not because it cooked our food or protected us from predators, but because it demanded something in return. Discipline, coordination, focus. Fire didn't just burn brighter, it made our thoughts burn longer. So here in the flickering light of ancient Schöningen, the evidence is not just that someone hardened a spear, it's that someone knew how, someone taught how, and someone thought it was worth doing, again and again. We don't know their names, we don't know their words, but we know their logic. And that logic left scorch marks in the record of time, and that leaves us once again with a haunting question. If fire helped shape the spear, did the spear in turn help shape the mind? But a campfire, no matter how carefully preserved, doesn't always survive the journey. Ember baskets fail, winds shift, rain drenches even the driest kindling. Across the long arc of human dispersal, especially through the changing ecologies of North Africa and into the harsh uplands of the Levant, there must have come moments, thousands upon thousands of them, when no fire could be found. The coals had died, the last torch had gone out, and the cold, the dark, the insects, and the predators waited patiently on the edge of the night. So what then? The question that quietly smoulders through this part of our story isn't just about convenience, it's about survival. Did our ancestors simply retreat, hoping to find another tribe's fire still smouldering? Did they huddle together, waiting for lightning to strike again? Or did someone strike stone against stone and watch the spark land just once in a perfect nest of dry grass? Somewhere in that liminal space between desperation and ingenuity, humanity crossed a threshold. Not when we used fire, not even when we preserved it, but when we finally learned to make it ourselves, and that changed everything. Because a creature that can carry fire is clever. But a creature that can summon it, from dry stone and patience, is something else entirely. The next stretch of our story explores one of the most elusive thresholds in our evolutionary memory. Not the hearth, not the flame, but the spark, the kind we may have forgotten how to look for, and the kind that still lives in the small quiet edge of a flint struck just right. Let's step into the dark and try to see the first spark we ever made. We like to imagine ourselves as the inventors of fire, the spark strikers, the makers of warmth and weaponry and light. But history, when we read it closely, doesn't tell that story. It whispers something older, something quieter, something we don't always want to hear. Because the truth is, fire was never ours. Not truly. Not first. It roared across continents long before we walked upright. It scorched forests and remade landscapes when the first vertebrates still breathed through gills. The oldest charcoal on Earth dates to the late Silurian period, around 420 million years ago, when land plants were just beginning to creep over the continents, and oxygen in the air had finally reached levels high enough for flames to breathe. That's not our timeline. That's Earth's. By the time hominins entered the scene, perhaps around 6 or 7 million years ago, fire was already a seasoned actor. It shaped ecosystems in Africa's emerging savannas, structured predator-prey dynamics, and seeded new plant communities that thrived in the burn scars of dry seasons. Elephants knew fire, so did birds, reptiles, even insects. There are accounts of modern raptors, hawks and falcons, picking up burning twigs and dropping them to spread flames, flushing out prey. Whether that behaviour is learned or instinctive, it tells us something important. Fire was not born in a single mind or in a single hand. It was a part of the world. The only question is who learned to follow it first, and learning isn't the same as owning. Across the long arc of prehistory, the animals who feared fire lived longer. The ones who watched it, followed it, scavenged behind it, they adapted. But somewhere in that watching, something shifted. Not all at once, not even predictably. It wasn't the biggest-brained hominins who first carried fire. It may not have even been the cleverest. It was the ones who stayed close enough to be warmed, but not burned. Close enough to see the charcoal, to notice the softened root, to smell the difference between raw meat and something roasted by accident. In that in-between, neither predator nor prey to the flame, our ancestors changed. Not because we were special, but because we were slow, scared and curious. And this is the part of the story we often forget, that most of what we call human progress isn't invention, it's inheritance. We didn't invent stone. We shaped what already lay at our feet. We didn't invent death rituals. We followed instincts older than language. And we didn't invent fire. We found it, feared it, followed it, carried it, and eventually learned how to keep it going. Even that was not a solo act. The idea that fire was the great turning point, the moment we became human, is compelling, but it's also lonely. It isolates us in our myth. When we look at the evidence with a quieter mind, a humbler mind, we see a different pattern, one of shared thresholds, shared strategies, fire used by multiple hominin species, hearths built and rebuilt by hands we can't classify, in caves we haven't finished excavating. At Gesher, Benot, 790,000 years ago, someone arranged clusters of burnt seeds, flint, and wood in patterns too precise for coincidence. At Wonderwerk, ash lies in deep cave sediments 1 million years old, possibly transported, possibly managed. At Taboon and Beech's Pit, fire wasn't just present, it was returned to, sustained, embedded in routine. And what's haunting is how many of those early firekeepers vanished. Homo erectus, Homo Heidelbergensis, Homo Naledi. All of them interacted with flame in ways that hint at continuity, cultural transmission, practice. But none of them survived to tell us what it meant. We inherited their ashes, not their thoughts. So perhaps the better question isn't who invented fire, but why we remember it this way. Why do we cling to the myth of the Promethean spark? The idea that a single moment, or a single species, broke through the veil of ignorance and lit the torch of civilization. Why does fire, more than any other tool, seem to carry the weight of our origin story? Maybe because it's visible, alive, a force we can't fully contain. Maybe because in the flickering of flames, we saw not just warmth or safety, but agency, a reflection of ourselves. Fire obeys for a moment, and then it doesn't. It feeds and consumes. It protects and destroys. It demands our attention. It flickers like thought. But none of that makes it ours. The story we tell now, the scientific one, is still just a draft, and a humble one, if we're honest. Every new dig site forces a revision. Every burnt seed or stone buried in unexpected strata cracks, open our neat timelines. The evidence doesn't whisper invention. It mutters adaptation, borrowing, sometimes even theft. So maybe we should stop asking who invented fire. Maybe the better question is who remembered it? Who passed down the skills to carry embers without burning fingers? Who knew which dung burned slowest? Who found the driest kindling? Who added one more stick before the wind picked up? Who sat beside it, again and again, watching, waiting, teaching others how not to be afraid? That's the true inheritance. Not the spark, but the patience. And maybe that's what fire really taught us. Not how to dominate nature, but how to pay attention, how to notice patterns, how to stay near something dangerous, long enough to learn. Fire was never just ours, but for a time it let us believe. And in that belief, that fragile flicker of confidence, we built the rest of our world. Out of fear, out of warmth, out of smoke. And maybe the real fire we carry now is the story itself. Even now, in a world of electricity, engines and screens, fire hasn't entirely left us. It lingers in our metaphors. We still say someone has a fire in them, or that an idea catches fire. We still gather around candles when the power fails. We light matches for comfort, for memory, for ceremony. Not because we need them to see or eat, but because we still carry a quiet reverence for the flame. And yet, the more we've tried to control fire, the more we've been reminded that it doesn't belong to us. We suppress wildfires until they burn uncontrollably. We build cities of fuel and are surprised when they go up in smoke. In the Anthropocene, our fire is not contained in hearths. It is global, planetary, locked inside carbon cycles we barely understand, feeding a climate we no longer manage. So perhaps the story of fire doesn't end with mastery. Perhaps it ends with memory and caution. Because if fire taught us anything in those first fragile encounters, it wasn't how to dominate the world. It was how to survive in a world where danger glows softly and never quite goes out. We are not the authors of fire. We are not even the first readers. But we may be the first species with the chance to understand that, and the last to decide how the story ends. And maybe, just maybe, that ember of understanding is the only spark we ever truly owned. The strange thing is, we still gather around fire. We've just made it invisible. It hums in the walls of our homes, inside wires and circuits. It pushes jets through the sky and launches probes past Pluto. It's no longer flickering in a hearth, but compressed into engines, bottled in power plants, controlled, or so we tell ourselves. Yet for all our mastery, we remain dangerously forgetful of what fire really is. A chemical appetite, an atmospheric agreement, a reaction waiting only for heat, fuel and oxygen. 3 things we've never had more of. Every year, it seems, we relearn this. Hillsides vanish under orange skies. Islands burn where once they flooded. Forests go quiet, then crackle. Whole towns, built by clever apes, vanish in hours. We respond with shock, rebuild with concrete and carbon, and wonder why the world keeps igniting. But fire never stopped. It never even slowed down. It has been burning under our feet since the Silurian period, long before the first tree. It has always belonged to the earth, not to us. And now, after all this time, it may be reminding us of that fact. There's a wordless irony in the way we came to be, that this heat, which once saved us from predators, may now be turning against the biosphere that made us, that our ancestors learned to carry embers across the savannah, and their descendants now carry heat into the sky itself. The story of fire was never just about kindling and warmth. It was about restraint, about memory, about learning when not to strike the spark. And in the end, perhaps our survival still depends on the same lesson, not in discovering fire again, but in remembering we were never its masters, only its students. If we could map fire across time the way we map rivers or migrations, its lines would trace something even older than language, a slow, glowing memory. It would show moments of brilliance, sparks flaring in the archaeological dark, and long silences where ash covered stone and nobody came back. And it would show now a towering spike, a saturation, a species that learned to make fire then forgot how to stop. This isn't just about wildfires, though those are now larger, faster and harder to contain than ever. This is about the kind of fire we've unleashed into systems that don't recover quickly. Peatlands that burned for centuries now dry and ignite in months. Permafrost once frozen solid now smoulders underground, releasing carbon built up since before we existed. Fires in the Amazon and Congo aren't always started by lightning or drought. Often, it's just a match. A tool once used for warmth, now lit for profit. And perhaps most ironically of all, the greatest fire humanity ever started isn't visible. It lives in the greenhouse gases we release by burning ancient sunlight. The coal, the oil, the gas. They're not different from the logs we once dragged into caves, just older, denser, and slower to disappear. It took us hundreds of thousands of years to tame fire. It took just 2 centuries to let it slip out of our hands. None of this is new knowledge. The data is there. The patterns repeat. What's harder to hold on to is perspective, that long human view. That this isn't just a modern problem or a scientific crisis. It's a continuation of something older than our species. A lesson we once learned by watching the world burn, and have to learn again, this time from within the fire, because for all the wonder fire brought us, cooked food, protection, community, heat, light, it always came at a cost. Forests cleared, animals driven out, air filled with smoke. Every benefit came with a risk, and for most of human history those risks were obvious, tangible, immediate. Now the costs are dispersed, harder to feel until it's too late. What happens when a tool becomes too familiar to question? When fire is no longer awe-inspiring but infrastructure? When combustion is background noise, not a conscious act? Perhaps the most dangerous thing we ever did with fire was to stop seeing it. But the ember of humility still burns in science. We don't have all the answers. And maybe that's the point. Every time we dig into the past, we uncover new contradictions. Fire in places we thought were dark. Hearths built by hominins we assumed were incapable. We once believed fire made us modern. Now we suspect it made us human long before we were ready to be either. And maybe the future depends not on some new invention, but on a return to that mindset. Careful observation, patience, a willingness to learn from what we can't control. We don't need to be the gods of fire. We just need to be better stewards. In some indigenous traditions, fire isn't something to conquer. It's a living presence, a being with agency. Not a servant, not an enemy, but a participant in the ecosystem. Western science is only now beginning to understand what that means. That landscapes need to burn, sometimes gently, sometimes regularly, to stay alive. That suppressing every fire can make the next one worse. That ecological balance sometimes glows. There's wisdom there. Not just ecological, but existential. That fire teaches us our limits. That it draws lines around our arrogance. That it burns brightest in the stories we tell, and dims when we forget how fragile our shelter really is. So as this story closes, maybe it's not a conclusion at all. Maybe it's a reminder that we come from fire, that we carry it still, in our cities, in our engines, in our very cells. That warmth can still be comfort and destruction and transformation all at once, and that we, the strange ape who borrowed lightning, who nursed embers across ice ages, who built nations and nightmares around a flickering flame, are not the final word on what fire becomes. The flame still burns, and we are not its masters, just the latest hands to hold it, just long enough, hopefully, not to be the last. And as always, stay curious, stay calm. I'll see you in the next story. Thank you, fellow sapiens, for wandering this timeline with me, for drifting into deep time, for slowing down and remembering. If this helped you fall asleep, helped you study, or simply helped you step out of the noise for a while, thank you for being here. If you think more people should know this story, you know what to do, like, subscribe, share it with the sapiens in your life, and tell me, are you listening before bed, while working, or somewhere in the world I can only imagine? And as always, stay curious, stay calm. I'll see you in the next story.